They spent $78 million on the aircraft. They called in 200 of the world's finest specialists, and for 42 days, nothing. A jet that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes sat completely dead on the tarmac. Every morning brought another expert. Every evening brought another failure. The answer was right there the entire time, standing quietly in a maintenance uniform, watching, waiting, saying nothing, because nobody ever asked. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story has traveled. And stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will change the way you look at the people around you forever. The call came at 4:47 in the morning. Victoria Sterling was already awake. She rarely slept past 4 anymore. Not since the company had crossed the billion-dollar threshold and the weight of it had decided to live permanently somewhere between her shoulder blades. She was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of her Nashville penthouse, holding a coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching the city lights blur in the October rain, when her phone lit up with Marcus Chen's name. Marcus was her director of operations. He did not call at 4:47 in the morning with good news. She picked up before the second ring. "Tell me." "The Gulf Stream." His voice had that particular flatness that meant he'd already cycled through panic and come out the other side into something worse, a kind of exhausted resignation. "She won't start. Ground crew ran the pre-flight at 4:15. Everything looked clean. Then they tried to fire the engines and got nothing. No fault codes, no warning lights, just nothing." Victoria set down the cold coffee very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands want to do something more violent. "I have a meeting in Geneva in 11 hours. "I know. There are people on 3 continents waiting on this deal." "I know, Victoria. Call Harmon Aviation. Tell them I need their best diagnostic team at Hartwell Field by 7. "Already did," Marcus said. "They'll have 4 people there by 6:30. She hung up and stood there for another moment, watching the rain. Then she went to get dressed, because standing still had never once solved a single problem in her life, and she wasn't about to let it start now. Hartwell Regional Airport sat about 19 miles southeast of Nashville's main hub, out where the highway thinned and the land opened up into rolling Tennessee farmland. It was the kind of airport that didn't make it onto maps people actually used. A single main runway, 2 smaller access strips, a modest terminal that served a handful of charter flights per week, and a maintenance facility that smelled permanently of hydraulic fluid and burned coffee. It was functional. It was unglamorous. It was exactly the kind of place that Victoria Sterling's $78 million aircraft should never have ended up, except that Hartwell was where Sterling Air kept its private fleet, because the land was cheap, the crew was reliable, and Marcus had made the call 4 years ago before anyone understood how large the company was going to get. She arrived at 6:20 to find the hangar already lit up like a surgical theater. Her aircraft, a Gulfstream G700 that she'd had fitted with custom interiors and communication systems, sitting open and exposed on the hangar floor, while 4 technicians from Harmon Aviation moved around it with the careful efficiency of people who charged by the hour and knew it. The lead tech, a heavy-set man named Pollard, who wore his credentials on a lanyard around his neck like armor, shook her hand with the particular confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve. "Ms. Sterling, we'll have a diagnosis within 2 hours. I need to be wheels up by 9. Pollard nodded as though that were completely reasonable. "We'll do everything we can." She believed him. She had no reason not to. They did not have a diagnosis within 2 hours. By 9 o'clock, Pollard's team had run 3 separate diagnostic sweeps and turned up exactly nothing. The aircraft's onboard systems reported full functionality across every parameter. Fuel lines were clean. Hydraulics were nominal. The avionics suite showed no errors. The engines, according to every piece of equipment Harmon Aviation had brought with them, were in perfect working order. But the engines would not start. Victoria rescheduled Geneva. It was the first time in 6 years she had rescheduled anything. She sat in the small glass-walled office that overlooked the hangar floor and watched Pollard's team work, and made 17 phone calls and drank 4 cups of coffee, and did not, under any circumstances, allow herself to lose her composure in front of anyone who worked for her. That was a rule she'd made for herself at 23, standing in her mother's kitchen after the bank had turned down her second loan application, and she'd kept it every day since. Inside, though, she was furious in the cold, focused way that she'd learned was more useful than the hot kind. By noon, Pollard's team had been joined by 2 additional technicians from a different firm. By 3 in the afternoon, there were 9 specialists in her hangar. By the end of the first day, the number had reached 14, and not one of them had an answer that made any sense. "The aircraft is telling us it's fine," Pollard said, in the tone of a man who found this more personally offensive than professionally troubling. "Every system is reading normal. There's no logical reason it won't start." "And yet," Victoria said. "And yet," he agreed, and looked at the Gulf Stream with an expression she recognized. It was the look of a man recalibrating how hard a problem actually was. She went home that night and sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything she knew, which wasn't much, and everything she didn't know, which was essentially everything that mattered. The days became a kind of grinding, expensive theater. By the end of the first week, Victoria's assistant had coordinated the arrival of specialists from 4 different countries. An avionics team from a firm in Seattle that had worked on military aircraft. 2 engine specialists from a company in Zurich that typically consulted for commercial airlines. A diagnostic engineer from Atlanta who had written a published paper on rare electronic faults in high-performance aircraft systems. They came with equipment and credentials and confidence, and they left with none of the confidence and all of the equipment and still no answers. The costs were staggering. Not just the consulting fees, which were significant on their own, but the cascading damage, the deals that had to be restructured, the partners who grew impatient, the contracts that had time-sensitive clauses that were beginning to approach their limits. Victoria's CFO, a precise woman named Diane Okafor, started including a running total at the bottom of her daily briefings. By the end of week 2, that number had 7 figures. By the end of week 3, it had climbed past $4 million in direct and indirect losses, not counting the cost of the specialists themselves. Marcus stopped mentioning the Geneva deal. There were other deals now, equally urgent, equally stalled. "There has to be a pattern," Victoria told her team during a Thursday evening call in week 4. 200 specialists don't all look at the same machine and come up empty unless there's something systematically wrong with how we're approaching this. "We've run every standard diagnostic protocol," said one of the current consultants, a soft-spoken man from a Houston aerospace firm who'd been working the problem for 9 days. "We've pulled apart the engine control system, the avionics interface, the fuel management system." "I understand what you've pulled apart," Victoria said. She didn't mean to sound sharp, but she was tired, and she'd heard variations of this sentence 11 times from 11 different people. "What haven't you pulled apart?" Silence on the line. "That's what I thought," she said, and ended the call. She started spending more time at the hangar. It wasn't a practical decision. There was nothing she could contribute to the technical investigation, and she had a company to run, which she was continuing to do from her laptop at a folding table in the glass-walled office that was gradually becoming a second headquarters. It was more that she found she couldn't stay away, that some stubborn part of her needed to be physically present with the problem instead of reading reports about it from a distance. That was how she started noticing Ethan Carter. He wasn't hard to overlook, which was, she would later understand, precisely the point. He was the maintenance supervisor at Hartwell, responsible for the airfield's smaller aircraft, the aging facilities, the daily operational machinery that kept the place running. He had nothing officially to do with Victoria's jet or the parade of specialists who had descended on it. He moved through the periphery of the investigation the way furniture moves through a room, present, useful in its own context, easy to look past when you were focused on something else. The first time she really registered him was on a Tuesday afternoon in week 3, when she happened to glance up from her laptop and saw him standing near the edge of the hangar, coffee thermos in one hand, watching Pollard's current replacement team run another diagnostic sweep. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. His expression was difficult to read. Not quite skeptical, not quite knowing, just attentive in a way that was qualitatively different from the way the consultants looked at the aircraft, which was the look of people trying to impose an answer they already suspected onto a machine that kept refusing to cooperate. She went back to her emails and forgot about it. She saw him again 2 days later in almost exactly the same spot, with the same posture and the same thermos. This time he was reading one of the maintenance reports that had been left on a workbench. Not one of his, but one from the most recent consulting team. He was reading it the way you read something you're not sure you believe, turning pages slowly, occasionally going back to reread a section. She watched him for almost a minute before he seemed to feel her attention and looked up. Their eyes met briefly across the hangar floor. He gave her a small, acknowledging nod, the kind of nod you give your neighbor when you pass them on the street, and went back to the report. Something about that bothered her in a way she couldn't immediately name. By week 5, Victoria had a new problem layered on top of the original one. The specialists, the current rotation of them, 3 engine diagnostics experts from a firm in Dallas, had begun to argue with each other. Not loudly, not unprofessionally, but with the particular tight-lipped tension of smart people who had run out of ideas and were starting to blame each other's ideas instead. She could hear it in the hangar, the clipped sentences, the long silences after suggestions were made. The way one man would demonstrate something and the others would find reasons to question the demonstration without offering anything better. She sat in her glass office and watched it happen and felt, for the first time in the entire ordeal, something close to despair. Not the dramatic kind. She wasn't built for dramatic despair. It was quieter than that. A low-grade certainty settling somewhere in the back of her mind that this was going to be the problem that didn't get solved. That her aircraft was going to sit in this hangar indefinitely, and the company was going to absorb the losses, and she was going to have to find another way to move forward. It was the first time in her professional life she'd seriously entertained the possibility that a problem might simply win. She was in the middle of this particular bleakness when her assistant, a relentlessly competent 24-year-old named Jordan, knocked on the office door. "Ms. Sterling, I have the updated consultant schedule for next week. We've got 2 firms confirmed from Chicago and 1 from—" "Who is that?" Victoria said. Jordan followed her gaze out through the glass to the hangar floor, where Ethan Carter was doing what he apparently did every few days, standing near the edge of the work area with his thermos, watching the current team run their procedures. "That's Ethan Carter. He's the maintenance supervisor here. He handles the—" "I know who he is officially," Victoria said. "I mean, who is he? What do you know about him?" Jordan hesitated in the way that meant they were about to say something they weren't sure was relevant. "He's been here about 6 years. Before Hartwell, he worked at a commercial maintenance facility in Memphis. Freight carriers, I think. Single dad, has a daughter in elementary school. He's the one who keeps this whole place running on about 1/3 of the budget it should have. The airfield manager mentioned him when we first arrived, said if we needed anything mechanically speaking, Ethan was the person to ask." Victoria looked at Jordan. "The airfield manager said that and you didn't think to tell me?" "We had 20 consultants from 5 different firms already on site by then. I didn't think—" Jordan stopped. "I should have mentioned it. I'm sorry." "Find out if he's free," Victoria said. She went to him, which was a small thing but mattered. She didn't send Jordan. She didn't ask him to come to the office. She walked across the hangar floor herself, in her good heels on the concrete, which was not designed for good heels, and she found him in the side maintenance bay where Hartwell kept its smaller aircraft, a pair of aging Cessnas and a King Air that had seen better years. And she knocked on the door frame, which she didn't strictly need to do since the bay was open, but which felt right. He looked up from the landing gear assembly he was working on. He had grease on the back of his left hand and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that she suspected he'd forgotten were there. "Ms. Sterling," he said in the tone of someone who wasn't particularly surprised. "Have you got a few minutes?" He considered this with what seemed like genuine deliberation, glancing at the landing gear and then back at her, making a small calculation. "Yeah," he said. "I've got a few minutes." She told him she wanted his read on the aircraft. She tried to say it without the particular inflection of desperation that she felt, and she wasn't entirely sure she succeeded. He was quiet for a moment, wiped his hands on a shop rag, set down his tools in the deliberate way of someone who was not in a hurry, regardless of what the situation called for. "You know I'm not a G700 certified tech," he said. It wasn't a refusal. It was more like he was making sure she understood the terms. "I know. I haven't worked on aircraft that size it's been a while. I know that too." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite parse, not wary, not eager, something more neutral than either. "What do you want from me exactly?" "I want you to look at it," she said. And tell me what you think, that's all. The teams you've had in here are a lot more qualified than I am. They haven't solved it. He didn't have an answer to that. He set down the shop rag. Let me see the maintenance records first, he said. All of them, not just the recent diagnostic reports, the full maintenance history going back to when you took delivery. I'll have them pulled. Tonight, if you can. I want to read them before I go near the aircraft. Tonight, she agreed. He nodded, and that was that. No performance, no promise that he'd crack it where everyone else had failed. He went back to the landing gear, and Victoria walked back across the hangar floor. And somewhere underneath the persistent weight of the past 5 weeks, she felt something that was unfamiliar enough that it took her a moment to identify it. It was the feeling that she might have finally asked the right person. She had the full maintenance records on his workbench by 7 that evening, 4 binders and a digital archive going back to the aircraft's delivery date 3 years prior. She half expected to find him gone for the day, but he was still there, and he'd made fresh coffee, and he didn't offer her any, which she found oddly respectful, as though he understood that this was work and not a social situation, and there was no need to observe the social rituals. He read for 2.5 hours. Victoria didn't stay. She had calls to take, and a company that kept running regardless of her personal crises. But she came back at 9:30 to find him still at it, the binders spread across the workbench with post-it notes bristling from the pages, his glasses now properly on his face instead of his forehead. He had a yellow legal pad with handwritten notes that she couldn't read from the door. Anything? She asked. He held up a finger without looking up. Not rude, just precise, finishing a thought. Then he set down his pen and looked at her over the glasses. When did you acquire this aircraft? 3 years ago. February? From whom? Northgate Aviation Holdings. They'd had it for about 18 months before we purchased it. Did you get the full service history from Northgate? She frowned. I have everything that was provided at acquisition. Why? There's a gap, he said. He opened one of the binders to a page with a post-it note on it. Between the manufacturer's delivery and Northgate's first maintenance entry, there's 14 months where there's no record of a specific software update that Gulfstream issued for the G700 fleet. It was a minor update, engine control module interface protocol. Most operators had it done within the first year. But if Northgate didn't log it, they might have missed it. Or they might not have done it, he said, which are different things. What does that mean for the aircraft? He was quiet for a moment. The way she was learning was characteristic of him, not hesitating exactly, but choosing precision over speed. I need to get into the avionics bay tomorrow and look at the ECM interface directly, not run diagnostics through the standard software. Actually look at the code. I want to see if there's a timing conflict between the engine control system and the flight management computer. A timing conflict, she repeated. It's a specific kind of fault. The two systems need to communicate within a certain time window every time you try to start the engines. If the protocol versions don't match exactly, if one system got updated and the other didn't, the aircraft sees it as a potential malfunction and shuts itself down before the engines can fire. It's a safety feature. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do. The problem is that every sensor reads normal because technically nothing is broken. Both systems are working correctly. They're just not working correctly together. She stared at him. That's what it is, she said. It wasn't a question. I don't know yet, he said, and he meant it. It fits the behavior, but I need to look at it before I tell you it's definitely that. Why didn't any of the other teams? Standard diagnostic software won't catch it, he said. It's too specific. You'd have to know what you were looking for to go looking for it. He paused. And most people who get called in on a problem like this are looking for broken things. This isn't a broken thing. It's a mismatch. Victoria stood in the doorway of the maintenance bay for a moment, looking at this man with his reading glasses and his post-it notes and his 6-year tenure at an airfield most people couldn't find on a map. How long have you suspected this? She said. He looked at her steadily. I want to be sure before I say something like that. She recognized a non-answer when she heard one, and she let it go. Bats. He was in the avionics bay at 6:15 the next morning, which Victoria knew because she arrived at 6:45, and he was already there, working with a laptop and a direct interface cable that bypassed the aircraft's standard diagnostic ports entirely. He wasn't using any of the equipment the consulting firms had left behind. He'd brought his own. Older stuff, some of it, tools she recognized as the kind that required actual knowledge of the systems rather than the ability to read automated results. She stood at the entrance to the bay and watched him work for a while. He was completely absorbed in it, not in the theatrical way of people who want to be seen concentrating, but in the genuinely disappearing way of someone whose attention had gone somewhere she couldn't follow. After about 20 minutes, he went still. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "There you are." Victoria's heart did something complicated. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. He was reading something on the screen, scrolling slowly, checking what she assumed was the code against something in his memory or his notes. He held up that one finger again, and she waited, and the hangar was very quiet except for the distant sound of someone's radio in the main facility. Then he turned the laptop toward her. She looked at the screen. She understood roughly 0% of what was on it. The engine control module is running firmware version 4.2.1, he said. The flight management computer is running 4.3.0. There was a protocol handshake update in 4.3.0 that changed the timing parameters for engine start authorization. When you try to start the engines, the FMC sends the authorization signal using the new protocol. The ECM is running the old protocol. It expects the signal 140 milliseconds earlier than it's arriving. So from the ECM's perspective, the authorization never comes. It interprets that as a possible control failure and initiates protective shutdown. Victoria looked at him. "And every sensor reads normal," she said, because both systems are functioning exactly as designed. There's nothing wrong with either of them. He leaned back slightly. Someone needed to update the ECM firmware when the FMC was updated. The update exists. Gulfstream issued it at the same time. It just never got applied to your aircraft. Because of the gap in the maintenance history. Yeah. She sat down on a metal stool that was positioned near the bay entrance, the kind of sitting down that happens when your legs make the decision before your brain has finished processing. "The fix," she said. "Update the ECM firmware to 4.3.0. Recalibrate the interface protocol so both systems are reading from the same timing sequence. Verify the handshake is clean, then test the start sequence." He paused. 3 hours, maybe a little more." 3 hours, she said, "give or take." 212 specialists, she said, and her voice came out slightly different than she intended, quieter, and with an edge she couldn't quite smooth out. 42 days. Ethan looked at the laptop screen. Specialized diagnostic equipment looks for faults within systems. This fault is between systems. You'd have to be thinking about the interaction rather than the individual components to go looking for it in the right place. And you were thinking about the interaction. He turned the laptop back toward himself. I was thinking about what the aircraft would have to be experiencing to behave the way it was behaving. Every time someone tried to start it under the right weather conditions. Barometric pressure affecting the timing slightly, making the mismatch just large enough to trigger the shutdown. That's why it didn't always fail. That's why it seemed intermittent at first. Victoria remembered the weather logs from the first week. The failed attempts had all been on colder mornings, higher pressure days. She'd noticed the correlation and mentioned it to one of the teams. They'd looked into the fuel system for temperature-related issues and found nothing. Nobody had thought to look at timing protocols. "Fix it," she said. He nodded and turned back to the screen, and she went to call Marcus with the first good news she'd had in 6 weeks. He worked through this morning with the focused quiet of someone for whom the work itself was sufficient company. Victoria hovered at a distance that she hoped wasn't annoying, occasionally stepping away to handle calls and emails, but always drifting back, unable to help herself. She watched him update the firmware through the direct interface, run a verification protocol, then spend nearly an hour with the recalibration, not rushing it, not performing the confidence that everything was going fine, just working through it step by methodical step. Once, around 9 o'clock, he stopped and stared at the screen for a full 3 minutes without moving. She thought about asking. She didn't. At 9:17, he exhaled through his nose and kept working. At 11:40, he climbed down from the avionics bay, closed it up, gathered his cables and tools, and walked around to the cockpit stairs. He glanced back at Victoria, standing near the hangar entrance. "You might want to step outside," he said. "In case." "In case what?" "In case I'm wrong." She didn't move. He almost smiled, the closest she'd seen from him, a small compression at the corners of his mouth, and turned back to the stairs. The sound of the cockpit door opening, the soft sounds of pre-flight checks being run, switches and panels in sequence, then a pause that felt much longer than it probably was. The engines began to spool. Slowly at first, that deep initial rotation building from near silence into a low, sustained frequency that Victoria could feel in her chest, and then the second engine joining the first, and the pitch climbing, both turbines accelerating through their startup sequence without hesitation, without interruption, without the abrupt shutdown that had ended every previous attempt for 42 days. The engines ran. Victoria stood in the hangar entrance with the sound filling the space around her, and felt something crack open in the center of her chest that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but something that existed in the strange territory between them. Something that felt, embarrassingly, like she might cry, which she absolutely was not going to do in her own hangar. She pressed her thumb and forefinger to the bridge of her nose for a moment. Then she walked out onto the tarmac and stood in the morning air and listened to her aircraft run. Wob. Ethan came down from the cockpit 18 minutes later. He was carrying his laptop and his cables, and he looked slightly tired, and there was still grease on the back of his left hand from the landing gear work the day before. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked at the running engines with the quiet look of someone checking their work rather than admiring it. Victoria crossed the tarmac toward him. "It needs a full operational test flight before you put it back in service," he said when she was close enough. "Run it through the full startup shutdown cycle a few times. Check the interface logs after each run. The calibration should hold, but you want to verify." "I will," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and started back toward the maintenance bay. "Ethan." He stopped and turned. She had the check in her jacket pocket. She'd prepared it the night before, after their conversation in the maintenance bay, when she'd started to believe this might actually be solvable. It was an amount significant enough that she'd written it 3 times to make sure she had it right. He looked at the check for a moment, then he took it, and he looked at the number, and something in his expression shifted. Not the explosion of surprise she'd half expected, but something quieter and more complex, a slight softening around the eyes that he recontrolled almost immediately. "This is a lot," he said. "It doesn't cover what you saved me," she said, and meant it. He folded the check carefully and put it in the front pocket of his work shirt. "Sophie's been needing new soccer cleats," he said, which was apparently his way of accepting it. "And the gutters on the house—" He stopped as though he'd said more than he intended. "Anyway, thank you. Can I ask you something?" He waited. "How long did you suspect the timing conflict before I asked you to look at it?" He was quiet for a long moment. The engines were still running behind them, a steady, disciplined roar that was, to Victoria, the most beautiful sound she'd heard in weeks. "A while," he said finally. She'd expected this, and she'd prepared herself for it, and it still landed harder than she expected. "Why didn't you say anything?" He looked at her with a directness that wasn't accusatory, just honest, the way someone looks at you when they're telling you something they think you probably already know. "Because nobody ever asked," he said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his bag and walked back across the tarmac toward the maintenance bay, and the engines kept running, and Victoria stood there with those 4 words arranging themselves in her chest like they were finding somewhere to stay permanently. Because nobody ever asked. She turned that over for a long time. The sun had moved significantly by the time she went back inside. Those 4 words didn't leave her. Victoria Sterling had a habit, developed sometime in her mid-20s when the company was still young enough that she could hold the entire operation in her head, of processing difficult things by running. Not on a treadmill. She'd always found treadmills philosophically depressing. The idea of working that hard to stay in exactly the same place, but outside, on actual ground, where the resistance was uneven and unpredictable and demanded your full attention. She ran 4 miles through her neighborhood that evening in the cooling October air, and she turned because nobody ever asked over and over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for its edges. The thing that bothered her wasn't the failure itself. Failure was something she'd made a kind of uncomfortable peace with over the years. Not the accepting kind of peace, more the grudging acknowledgement that it existed and would continue to exist, regardless of her opinion on the matter. What bothered her was the specific shape of this particular failure. 212 people, 42 days, millions of dollars. And the answer had been standing 19 feet from the problem the entire time, in a work shirt with someone else's maintenance schedule tucked under his arm, watching. She'd built her company on the principle that the right information, in the hands of the right person, at the right moment, was worth more than any amount of capital. She'd said that in interviews, she'd said it to her leadership team. She'd believed it with the particular conviction of someone who had actually tested the principle and found it sound. And then she'd spent 6 weeks and several $1 million completely failing to live by it. She ran harder the last half mile and came home winded and irritated and slightly better, the way a hard run usually left her. And she stood in her kitchen drinking water and staring at the wall and thought about Ethan Carter reading maintenance reports in the hangar at 7 in the evening like it was something he did every day, which apparently it was. Which apparently had been true for years, and nobody had bothered to factor that into anything. Marcus called while she was in the shower. She let it go to voicemail and then listened to it while toweling off. He was calling to confirm that the test flight protocols were being arranged and that the Geneva partners had been contacted again and that there was significant relief on all sides. And did she want to handle the follow-up calls herself, or should he take them? Standard Marcus, efficient, thorough, already 17 steps ahead of the problem. She called him back. "I want to run a background on Ethan Carter," she said when he picked up. A brief pause. "The maintenance supervisor. Full professional history. I want to know every facility he's worked at, what he handled, what the outcomes were. Whatever's available." "Can I ask why?" "Because I made a decision about someone based on his job title and where he worked," she said, "and I want to know what I actually missed." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He'd worked with her long enough to recognize the particular register in her voice that meant a decision had already been made and the question was purely procedural. "I'll have something for you by tomorrow morning." "Thank you," she said, and hung up. She stood at her bedroom window for a while, looking at the city, thinking about a man who went home every night to an 8-year-old daughter and aging gutters and soccer cleats that needed replacing, who had known something that 200 experts didn't know, and had stayed quiet about it because the culture of the room had made silence the path of least resistance. That was the part she couldn't get past. It wasn't that he'd been overlooked. Overlooked things happened. That was a failure of process, and process could be fixed. It was that the environment she'd created, or at minimum allowed to exist, had made it functionally easier for a person with the answer to say nothing than to say something. That was a failure of something deeper than process. That was a failure of what the room communicated about whose knowledge mattered and whose didn't. She didn't sleep especially well. The test flight happened 2 days later. Victoria was on the tarmac for both the pre-flight and the departure, which was not technically necessary but felt, at this point, non-negotiable. She watched her chief pilot, a careful 20-year veteran named Roland Finch, who had been quietly devastated by the grounding and had tried not to show it in front of anyone, complete the pre-flight checks with an expression of focused concentration that was only slightly belied by the way his shoulders had dropped about 2 inches from where they'd been sitting for the past 6 weeks. Ethan was there too, at the edge of the tarmac, which she'd asked for specifically. She'd told Marcus to let him know the test flight was happening and that his presence was requested, and Ethan had said through Marcus that he'd be there, and he was, with his thermos and his work jacket and the particular quality of stillness that she was starting to recognize as simply how he occupied space. Roland ran the startup sequence. Everyone on the tarmac went quiet in that involuntary way of a group of people collectively holding their breath. The engines spooled, both of them, clean and uninterrupted, reaching operating RPM with the smooth assurance of machinery doing exactly what it was designed to do. Roland's voice came through the radio, steady and professional, and carrying underneath it something that was almost imperceptible unless you'd heard it absent for 6 weeks. Relief. "All systems nominal. We are go for taxi." The aircraft moved. It rolled out of the Hartwell apron and down the taxiway and turned onto the runway, And then it was accelerating, and then it was lifting, rotating up into the Tennessee morning sky with a cleanliness that made Victoria press her teeth together briefly, because the alternative was something she'd already decided she wasn't going to do. She turned to find Ethan watching the aircraft climb. His expression was the same quiet attention he'd worn through the entire 6 weeks, but there was something slightly different underneath it now. Something she might have called satisfaction if she thought he was the kind of person who used that word about himself. He wasn't. She was already fairly sure of that. "It'll need 3 full cycles," he said, still watching the aircraft. "Startup, full operational run, shutdown. See if the handshake holds at different engine temperatures. Roland knows to check the interface log after each one. I talked to him yesterday," she said. "He knows." Ethan nodded. They stood there in the jet wash and the morning air, not saying anything, watching the Gulf Stream arc north over the tree line. And the silence between them had the particular quality of a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It was just 2 people watching the same thing and not needing to narrate it. After a while, Victoria said, "The background check came back this morning." He turned to look at her then, not alarmed exactly, but alert. "You ran a background on me," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was more like he was confirming the terms of the conversation. "Professional history," she said. "I wanted to understand what I was looking at." He turned back to the sky, where her aircraft had become a small geometry against the blue. "And?" "Memphis Freight Maintenance, 6 years. You took over as lead technician 18 months in and cut their diagnostic turnaround time by 40%. Before that, you were at a commercial maintenance facility in Knoxville, where you apparently identified a systemic fuel system issue in their King Air fleet that 3 previous audits had missed. Before that, you were a line mechanic in the Air Force for 4 years, which explains some things." He didn't say anything. "The man who ran the Memphis facility told my team that losing you to Hartwell was the single worst staffing outcome of his career, and he'd been trying to figure out how to get you back ever since." She paused. He said that in a very straightforward way, like it was simply a fact, not something he was saying for effect. "Gerald's a good man," Ethan said, in the tone of someone changing the subject. "Why did you leave Memphis for Hartwell?" A beat. "Sophie's mom and I. It ended. She moved to Atlanta. I needed to be close to Sophie." He said it simply, without the performance of hardship. Hartwell was the closest maintenance position I could find to where her school is. Took a significant pay cut. It was what it was. Victoria absorbed this. "And you've been here 6 years. 6 years, he confirmed, getting paid about 1/3 of what you'd be earning anywhere else." He looked at her sideways. "You really did a thorough background." "I'm good at knowing what questions to ask," she said, "when I decide to ask them." The emphasis was deliberate, and he heard it, and he let it pass without comment, which she appreciated. "The offer," she said. "I want to make a formal one." He was quiet. "Director of Maintenance for the Sterling Air Private Fleet. It's currently managed by an outside firm that clearly has limitations." She kept her voice neutral on that last part, though it cost her something. "I want it in-house, and I want someone running it who actually understands these aircraft rather than someone who understands the diagnostic software that's supposed to understand these aircraft." He didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that she started calculating whether she'd misjudged this, whether she'd read the situation wrong, whether he was simply going to say no and she was going to have to figure out what to do with that. "What would it actually involve?" he said finally. She'd prepared for this. She took him through it. The scope, the resources, the team he'd be building, the travel expectations, the compensation package she'd had Diane put together the previous afternoon. She tried to give it to him straight, without the sales inflection she used in boardrooms, because something told her that sales inflection would be the exact wrong approach with this particular person. He listened without interrupting. He was good at listening. She'd noticed that. He didn't fill silences with affirmations or nods or small vocalizations to prove he was tracking. He just listened. When she finished, he said, "I need to think about it." "Of course. And I need to talk to Sophie." She hadn't expected that, or rather, she hadn't consciously expected it. But when he said it, it felt completely consistent with everything she'd observed about him. "Okay," she said. "She's 8, he added, as though clarifying why this conversation mattered. She's got a lot of opinions. I'd imagine. The aircraft was a speck now, far north over the hills. Ethan watched it for another moment and then looked down at his thermos. How long do I have? Take the time you need, she said, which was not quite true. She was Victoria Sterling, and her threshold for open-ended timelines was professionally limited. But which was the right thing to say to this man, in this moment, and she meant it more than she usually meant things she said for effect. He nodded and started back toward the maintenance bay. She watched him go and thought that she had spent 30 years learning to read rooms and people and situations, and she was relatively confident she was good at it, and she was also aware that she had completely failed to read Ethan Carter for 6 weeks while he stood 15 feet from her. That was not a comfortable thing to sit with. But discomfort had always been how she learned things, and she'd gotten better over the years at letting it do its work rather than arguing with it. The call from Roland came at 2:17 that afternoon. 3 cycles, he said. Perfect handshake every time. Interface logs are clean. She's ready to fly. Victoria was in a conference call with partners in Singapore when the message came through, and she excused herself with an apology that she did not entirely feel, which was unusual because she was normally very good at feeling her apologies to international business partners. She stepped out to the hallway of her Nashville office. She'd come in properly for the first time in weeks, and called Roland back. No anomalies? None. I pushed it through some edge conditions in the weather. Flew at altitude where barometric variance was significant. Nothing triggered. The calibration is solid. He paused. Ms. Sterling, whoever figured this out, they knew exactly what they were doing. Yes, she said. They did. She went back into the conference call and finished the meeting and then sat in her office for a while doing something she almost never did, which was nothing. Just sitting. Looking at the city through her windows, which were the same floor-to-ceiling type as her penthouse, because she'd discovered early that the height was useful. It gave her a sense of perspective when the small problems were threatening to obscure the larger picture. She thought about the past 6 weeks. She thought about the cascade of cost, not just the millions in consulting fees and delayed deals, but the subtler, more corrosive cost of having her entire operation in a kind of suspended state, the way an organization holds its breath when its leader's attention is consumed by a single problem. She thought about the 14 deals that had been affected in varying degrees, and the partners who had absorbed the uncertainty with varying degrees of grace, and the team members who had spent 6 weeks reading the tension in her face and worrying about what it meant. And she thought about the fact that the person with the answer had been there on day 3, or day 5, or day 10 at the latest. He hadn't said, and she hadn't pressed him, watching the whole thing unfold from the sidelines because nobody had thought to ask the maintenance supervisor what he thought. Not because they'd evaluated him and found him insufficient. They hadn't evaluated him at all. His title said maintenance supervisor, and the facility said small regional airfield, and those 2 data points had done the entire job of making him invisible, and that was the machine she'd allowed to operate unchecked inside her own organization. She picked up her pen and wrote something on the legal pad she kept on her desk. Not for anyone else, just to make it concrete. The way she'd always found writing things down made them concrete. The assumption of irrelevance is not a neutral act. It costs things. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to the next page and started drafting changes to her consulting intake process, because something had to come from this beyond a lesson that only lived in her head. Ethan called the next morning, which was a Friday. It was earlier than she expected, 6:50, while she was still on her first coffee, and the call itself was shorter than she'd prepared for. I talked to Sophie, he said. And? A pause, and she heard something in the background, such cartoons maybe, or the particular kind of morning noise that surrounded children who were awake at 6:50 on a Friday and not especially concerned about other people's phone calls. She said I always tell her that knowledge only matters if you use it. Another pause. So she wants to know why I'm not following my own advice. Victoria smiled, which was not something her face did in a particularly elaborate way, but it happened. She sounds like a smart kid. Yeah. He said it with the particular tone of a parent who is simultaneously proud of and slightly exhausted by a child's intelligence. Too smart, sometimes. And? Victoria said. I have some conditions. Tell me. Sophie comes first, he said, directly and without apology. If there's a school thing, a doctor's appointment, if she needs me, I'm there. I'll make the work hours work, I'll stay late when I need to, but that's non-negotiable. Agreed. I want full access to the technical resources, not filtered through a procurement process that takes 3 months. If I identify a diagnostic need, I want to be able to move on it. I'll make it work, she said, and there's a coffee machine at your company headquarters. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard from him before, something that was dry and deliberate and might, in someone less serious, be called humor. Marcus showed me a photo of the building when he explained the role. I saw the machine in the lobby. Victoria blinked. What about it? It's a commercial pod machine, Ethan said, with the tone of a man delivering a diagnosis. Someone made a bad purchasing decision, and now everyone is suffering for it. I want to fix that on my first day before any executive meetings. She stared at her phone for a second. You want to fix the coffee machine, she said. It's a morale issue, he said. You can tell a lot about an organization from how they treat their coffee situation. The laugh that came out of Victoria was genuine enough that it surprised her slightly. It had been a while since she'd been genuinely surprised by a laugh. Agreed, she said. All 3 conditions. Then I'll take the job. She set her coffee down. When can you start? I need 2 weeks to transition the Hartwell maintenance responsibility. I'm not going to leave them short-handed. I'll find a replacement and make sure they know the systems before I go. She hadn't asked him to do that, and the fact that he was doing it without being asked told her, again, something she was accumulating alongside everything else she knew about him. 2 weeks is fine, she said. Okay, he said, and then, after a moment, thank you for asking. The particular weight he placed on those last 2 words was subtle enough that someone listening casually might not have caught it. Victoria caught it. Thank you for answering, she said. The 2 weeks felt longer than 6 weeks had, which made no logical sense and was entirely true. Victoria was back in full operational mode. The Geneva meeting had been rescheduled and executed, the delayed deals had been revived and in 2 cases improved by the delay, because sometimes a forced pause created space for better terms, and she'd learned to look for those inversions. The company was moving again, and with it the particular high-frequency energy that she ran on and was honest enough with herself to acknowledge she was slightly addicted to. But she kept tracking the Hartwell situation in the background. She asked Marcus for weekly updates, which was unusual. She normally delegated and didn't hover. And Marcus, to his credit, understood that this was not hovering for the usual reasons and gave her the updates without editorializing. Ethan had found a replacement within 4 days. A former student of his, apparently, a young woman named Casey, who'd been working at a facility in Clarksville and whom Ethan had been informally mentoring for about 2 years. He'd called her on a Tuesday evening, and by Thursday she'd driven out to Hartwell and walked through the facility with him for most of the day, and by Friday the transition plan was in place. He trained her on every system in 3 days, Marcus reported. The Hartwell manager is actually more confident in the replacement than he was expecting to be. Of course he is, Victoria said. The other thing, and I'm not entirely sure how to report this, so I'll just tell you what I saw. When I went out there to sort some of the administrative transition, the other staff at Hartwell, the ground crew, and the front desk people, the fueling team, they all came out to say goodbye to him. Not in a scheduled way, just they were there. A couple of them had brought food. One of the ground crew guys looked like he was actually upset about it. Victoria absorbed this. How did Ethan seem? He seemed like someone who had mixed feelings but didn't intend to express them in public, Marcus said. He shook everyone's hands and helped the fueling crew with a stuck valve on one of the auxiliary carts before he left, even though he'd already formally handed over his duties. Just did it because it needed doing. She thought about that for a while after she hung up. There was a version of this story she knew that could be told as a triumphant discovery narrative. The brilliant diamond in the rough, found at last and elevated to his proper place. She'd heard that story told about other people in other industries, and she'd always found it faintly dishonest because it centered the person doing the discovering rather than the person being discovered, and it implied that the elevation was a correction of some natural disorder when usually the disorder was the system itself. Ethan Carter wasn't a diamond in the rough. He was a competent, serious, quietly exceptional person who had spent 6 years doing excellent work at a small airfield while raising a kid alone, and who had been ignored not because of any deficiency, but because the people with the power to ask questions had been asking them in the wrong rooms. That was the actual story. She made a note to herself, another one on the same legal pad, to figure out how many other Ethan Carters might be operating in the periphery of her company right now, doing work that nobody was accounting for because their titles didn't suggest it and their facilities didn't announce it. That note got transferred to a proper document and sent to Marcus with a subject line that said simply, Organizational Audit, Overlooked Competency. Let's talk Monday. Marcus replied within 4 minutes with, On it, was wondering when you'd get here, which was Marcus's way of telling her something she probably should have known sooner, and which she accepted with the same ungraceful grace she tried to apply to all the things she should have known sooner. Ethan arrived on a Monday. He drove himself, which she'd offered to arrange otherwise, and he'd declined, in a truck that was a few years past its prime, but clearly well-maintained, which was on brand in a way that she found either funny or moving, depending on what angle she was coming at it from. Sophie was not with him. She was in school, which was where Sophie was on Monday mornings, because Ethan was not the kind of person who disrupted his daughter's routine for his own logistical convenience. She'd start at her new school the following week, after the weekend transition, and Ethan had apparently spent considerable time over the previous 2 weeks coordinating with the school counselor about the adjustment, which was a level of parental preparation that most adults she knew didn't apply to anything. He came to the lobby in the same work jacket he'd worn at Hartwell, which was not quite right for the environment. Headquarters was a glass and steel building in the Gulch neighborhood, the kind of building that had a concierge, and which he didn't seem especially concerned about. The coffee machine was, in fact, terrible. Victoria had known this in a vague, background way. She had a proper espresso setup in her private office, so the lobby machine had never been her personal problem. But she'd never looked at it the way she found herself looking at it now, through whatever lens Ethan had handed her in the past few weeks. The lens that asked what small systemic failures were hiding in plain sight, because no one in a position to address them had thought to look. He spent 22 minutes on it. Victoria watched from across the lobby, pretending to review something on her phone, while he disassembled the machine's exterior panel, identified what appeared to be both a mechanical issue and a programming error in the dispensing sequence, fixed both, reassembled it, and ran a test cycle. He handed a cup to the young man at the front desk, who had been watching with the expression of someone witnessing something they couldn't quite categorize. The desk attendant tasted it. His eyebrows went up. "That's actually really good," he said. "Yeah," Ethan said, in the tone of someone confirming a fact rather than receiving a compliment. It was always going to be good. It just needed someone to sort out what was wrong with it. He picked up his bag and looked across the lobby to where Victoria was standing, and she realized she'd completely failed at the pretending to review her phone thing, and she didn't particularly care. "Ready?" she said. "Ready?" he said. They walked toward the elevators, and behind them, the front desk attendant was already telling someone on his radio about the coffee machine, and somewhere in the building, a version of things that hadn't been working was quietly starting to work, and that was, Victoria thought, as good a beginning as any. The elevator ride to the 14th floor took 43 seconds, which Victoria knew because she'd timed it once during a particularly slow week, and in those 43 seconds neither she nor Ethan said anything. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was more the silence of two people who had already negotiated something significant and were now in the brief pause before the next thing began. The elevator opened to the main operations floor. Open plan, lots of glass, the particular low hum of an organization that ran across multiple time zones and therefore never fully stopped. And Victoria watched Ethan take it in. He didn't react the way people usually reacted to her headquarters for the first time. Most visitors did something. Looked up at the ceiling height, took in the city view through the south-facing windows, registered the scale of the place in some visible way. Ethan looked at it the way he looked at the aircraft, methodically, left to right, like he was cataloging systems rather than aesthetics. "Operations floor," she said. "Your office is 1 floor up. I'll show you after the introductions." "Okay," he said. Marcus was waiting near the central cluster of desks, and seeing Marcus and Ethan in the same frame for the first time was briefly disorienting. Marcus in his tailored charcoal suit, Ethan in his work jacket, both of them completely self-possessed in ways that had nothing to do with what they were wearing. Marcus extended his hand. "Ethan, good to finally meet you properly." "Same," Ethan said, and shook it. And that was the entirety of the greeting, which Marcus seemed to find perfectly adequate. The introductions moved through the core team with the efficient courtesy of a well-run organization. Diane Okafor, who shook Ethan's hand and immediately started asking him about his approach to maintenance budget allocation, with the focused energy of someone who'd been waiting to have this conversation. Jordan, who had done the background research and who greeted Ethan with the specific warmth of someone who already felt they knew a person. Roland Finch, who came up from the operations side and shook Ethan's hand for slightly longer than normal, because Roland was a man who understood what Ethan had done for his aircraft and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "Clean interface logs every single cycle," Roland said. "I've been flying that aircraft for 3 years and I've never heard the engine sound that settled." "They were always going to sound like that," Ethan said. "They just had a communication problem." Roland looked at him for a moment and then laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that comes out when something lands unexpectedly true. "Yeah," he said, "I guess that's exactly what it was." The thing Victoria noticed, watching this circuit of introductions, was that Ethan was consistent in a way most new hires weren't. People arriving in a new organization with a significant title and a backstory like his usually performed some version of themselves, either the deliberate modesty of someone managing expectations or the compensatory confidence of someone overriding nerves. Ethan was simply the same in every interaction. Not flat, there was warmth there, and humor in the dry, understated form she was beginning to recognize as his natural register. But stable, the way a well-calibrated instrument is stable, regardless of the conditions around it. She noted this and filed it somewhere useful. The office on the 15th floor was a corner room with 2 walls of windows overlooking the gulch, and beyond it, the curve of the Cumberland River. It was significantly nicer than anything Ethan had occupied before, a fact that was obvious and that nobody mentioned. The desk was large and clear, the way Victoria's assistant had prepared it, and someone had placed a technical reference manual for the G700 and 2 other aircraft in the Sterling Air Fleet on the corner of the desk, because Jordan paid attention to that kind of detail. Ethan set his bag down and looked at the windows for a moment. "You don't have to take the corner office," Victoria said from the doorway. "If you'd rather something more central to the maintenance facilities." "No, this is fine," he said. Then, after a beat, "It's a lot of window." "It is. Sophie's going to want to see this." There was something in the way he said it, not performing sentimentality, just a plain statement of what was true, that was harder to respond to than she expected. "Bring her by whenever," Victoria said. "On a weekend, if it's easier." He nodded, still looking at the windows. Then he turned around and looked at the office as a whole, the space, the desk, the reference manuals Jordan had left, and whatever internal process he was running reached some kind of conclusion, because his posture shifted slightly, that small settlement that meant a person had decided to be somewhere. "Where do we start?" he said. "The current maintenance contracts," she said. "All 3 of our fleet aircraft are serviced by Meridian Aviation Services. I want your read on whether to keep that relationship or bring the capability in-house. I'll need the contract terms and the full service history for all 3 aircraft. On the shared drive, Jordan will send you the access." She paused. "I'd also like your initial read within 2 weeks. I know that's fast." 2 weeks is enough," he said, "if the records are organized." "They're organized," she said. "Diane runs a tight ship." "Good." He pulled out the chair, looked at it briefly, checking the height, she thought, the small automatic adjustments of someone who spent a lot of time at workbenches, and sat down. He opened the G700 manual and placed his hand flat on the page, not reading yet, just orienting. Victoria remained in the doorway for a moment, watching him, and then decided she'd watched enough and had her own work to get back to. "I'll leave you to it," she said. "One thing," he said without looking up. She waited. "The maintenance logs you had from the previous 6 months, the ones the Meridian team submitted, I read through them last night. He looked up then. There are 2 entries that bother me. She felt something tighten in the back of her awareness. Which aircraft? The Phenom 300. There's a notation in the hydraulic system inspection from August. The tech flagged a minor pressure variance in the nose gear actuator and marked it resolved. But there's no follow-up verification entry. In a system with a variance flag, you'd normally see a second check within 30 days to confirm the resolution held. And the second entry? The G550, September inspection. The oxygen system service notation is missing the batch number for the replacement cylinders. That's a compliance issue, not a mechanical one, but if there's an FAA audit. There was one scheduled for November, Victoria said. Her voice was flat in the way it got when she was controlling something. Then you need to get Meridian on the phone today, he said. Not tomorrow, today. Get the cylinder batch documentation and get it logged. The nose gear thing is probably fine. Pressure variances in that actuator do often self-correct. But you want a verification check done before the Phenom goes back in service. The Phenom 300 had completed a flight to Atlanta 3 days ago. Victoria stood in the doorway and absorbed this for a moment. How long would it have taken the Meridian team to catch this on their own? Ethan looked back at the manual. Hard to say. Maybe the November audit would have surfaced the oxygen documentation issue. The hydraulic thing. He paused. Maybe never. It's the kind of thing that sits quiet until it isn't. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus as she walked back to the elevator. Cancel whatever I have at 10, she said when he picked up. I need you in my office in 15 minutes and get Meridian's account manager on hold. Ethan Carter found 2 issues in the maintenance logs on his first morning, and one of them has an FAA audit timeline attached to it. A brief pause on Marcus's end. He's been in the building for what, 40 minutes? 43, she said, and got in the elevator. The Meridian situation resolved over the next 4 days in the grinding, slightly mortifying way that these things resolved. Phone calls and document retrieval, and the particular organizational defensiveness of a service provider who'd been caught in a compliance gap and needed to not admit it too directly while also fixing it quickly enough that the audit went cleanly. Ethan was on 2 of those calls, saying very little, answering specific technical questions when asked, and not editorializing on Meridian's culpability, which Victoria appreciated because she was doing enough internal editorializing for both of them. The FAA documentation was corrected and filed within 48 hours. The Phenom's nose gear actuator was rechecked by an independent tech that Ethan identified and coordinated, someone he knew from Memphis who now ran a small precision maintenance operation in Brentwood, and the pressure variance was confirmed resolved. The audit, when it came in November, found nothing. Victoria told Ethan this after the audit cleared, in the corridor outside his office, in passing, because she wasn't going to make a thing of it. Good, he said. The auditor complimented our documentation, she added. He looked at her briefly. Document everything, was all he said, and went back into his office. And she continued down the corridor thinking that she genuinely could not tell if he was being dry or sincere, and had increasingly come to believe it was both simultaneously. The 2-week initial assessment on the Meridian contracts came in on a Thursday, on time, in a format that was not the glossy presentation decks her leadership team typically produced, but a clear, direct written document that said exactly what he thought without organizational softening. His recommendation was to keep Meridian for routine line maintenance while building an in-house capability for the diagnostics and systems-level work that required deeper aircraft knowledge than Meridian's generalist teams reliably had. He'd included a hiring roadmap and a rough cost comparison that Diane, when she saw it, described as uncomfortably accurate. He used actual labor market data, Diane told Victoria, in the slightly stunned tone of someone who had expected a ballpark and gotten a survey. He went and looked up current hiring rates in 3 cities and cross-referenced them against our operational patterns. I don't know when he found the time. I don't think he thinks of it as separate from the work, Victoria said. What does that mean? It means he doesn't stop paying attention just because the immediate task is done. Diane looked at her for a moment. Where did you find this man? He was already there, Victoria said. I just eventually asked. Sophie Carter arrived for her first visit to the headquarters on a Saturday morning in November, approximately 3 weeks after Ethan started, delivered by her father at 9 o'clock in the Sterling Air lobby, because Sophie had announced at dinner on Friday that she wanted to see where Dad worked, and couldn't they go tomorrow? And Ethan had called Victoria with what she sensed was a slightly apologetic warning, and Victoria had said come whenever, which she'd meant. Victoria was there when they arrived, which had required some adjustment to her morning, because she was at headquarters most Saturday mornings anyway, but typically arrived at 7 and was deep into email by 9. She told herself she was there because she had work to do, which was true, and not because she was curious about Sophie, which was also true and which she was aware of. Sophie was small for 8, with her father's brown eyes and a soccer shin guard still faintly outlined in dirt on her left leg because she'd had practice the previous afternoon and apparently the bath hadn't been thorough. She was wearing a hoodie that said Tennessee Valley Youth Soccer on it in letters that were beginning to peel, and she looked at the lobby with the unfiltered assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to moderate her first reactions. "It's very shiny," she said to no one in particular. "Sophie," Ethan said with the automatic parental correction of a man who'd had this specific conversation before. "It is shiny, though," Sophie said, in the tone of someone who considered this a neutral observation rather than a criticism, which it apparently was, because she followed it immediately with, "I like the ceiling," while looking up at the atrium with an expression of genuine appreciation. Victoria crouched down slightly. Not all the way. She wasn't going to condescend to the kid, and introduced herself. Sophie looked at her with the direct, slightly evaluating gaze of a child who had been raised to look at people when they spoke to her. "You're the one who gave my dad the job," she said. "He gave himself the job," Victoria said. "He earned it. I just offered." Sophie considered this with the seriousness of someone who was actually weighing it. "He says that you asked him when everyone else didn't notice him." Ethan made a quiet sound that was not quite clearing his throat. "He knew things that were important," Victoria said, "and I was slow to ask about them. That was a mistake I made, and I'm glad I eventually corrected it." Sophie looked at her a little longer, and Victoria had the unusual experience of feeling assessed by someone who was 4'2" and missing a tooth on the lower left side. "Okay, Sophie said finally, apparently satisfied, and looked back up at the ceiling. Ethan caught Victoria's eye over the top of Sophie's head with an expression that contained approximately 7 things at once, one of which was apology, and one of which was something warmer that didn't have a clean name. "Can I see Dad's office?" Sophie asked. "Absolutely," Victoria said, and gestured toward the elevators. Sophie, it turned out, had opinions about a great number of things. She thought the elevator was too slow, which was fair. She thought the operations floor looked like something from a movie, specifically a spy movie, which was a comparison Victoria had not previously considered but now couldn't unsee. She thought her father's corner office was, in her exact words, kind of too big for just one person, but the windows really good, which was the most accurate architectural review Victoria had heard in some time. She sat in Ethan's chair, which swallowed her, and spun it once with an expression of satisfaction, and then climbed out and went to stand at the window and look at the river. "You can see the whole city," she said. "Most of it," Ethan said. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed in the way he stood when he was watching something he found worth watching. "Which direction is school?" He pointed. She pressed her nose briefly against the glass and then seemed to decide that was sufficient and turned around. Her attention landed on the technical manuals on the corner of the desk, and she picked one up with the proprietary ease of a child in her parents' space. "Is this for the airplane you fixed?" "The one I fixed is this one," he said, pointing to a different manual. "That one's for a smaller aircraft we also operate." "Do they all have the same problem?" "No. Every aircraft has different problems, sometimes similar ones, but rarely the same." Sophie put the manual down and looked at him. "Is this job harder than the old one?" "Different," he said. "More responsibility. More resources." "Do you like it?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way Victoria had come to recognize as him actually considering a question rather than defaulting to a polite answer. "I think I'm going to like it," he said. "Ask me in 6 months." Sophie seemed to accept this as reasonable. She looked at Victoria. "Do you like your job?" Victoria blinked. "Yes," she said. "Most days." What about the bad days? On the bad days, I think about what I do instead, Victoria said. And then I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing, so I go back to work. Sophie thought about this. Dad says the same kind of thing, she said. Except he also says on really bad days he thinks about our spaghetti dinners. Ethan uncrossed his arms and looked at a point slightly above the window. Sophie, he said. What? It's true. I know it's true. Then why are you making the face? The face in question was the face of a man who had not intended to share that particular piece of information in this particular context, and Victoria stored it alongside everything else she was accumulating about Ethan Carter and his remarkable daughter. It's a good reason, Victoria said. Spaghetti dinners are important. Sophie nodded with the vindicated energy of someone who had just been supported by a credible third party. See? She told her father. I see, he said dryly and pushed off the doorframe. We should let Ms. Sterling get back to her work. Victoria said. And then, because she hadn't planned to say it, but it was the right thing. You can call me Victoria. Both of you. Sophie looked at her with the same evaluating directness as before, and then something relaxed in her face. Not dramatically, just a small settlement, the way trust lands when it decides to land. Okay, Victoria, she said. The 6 weeks that followed were not smooth, and Victoria would have been suspicious if they had been. Ethan's arrival reorganized things in ways that were necessary and therefore not without friction. The first significant one came from inside the Meridian relationship, specifically from a mid-level account manager named Trescott, who had been the primary contact for Sterling Air's maintenance contracts for 3 years, and who responded to Ethan's involvement with the particular territorial defensiveness of someone who understood that the new arrangement represented a reduction in Meridian's operational scope and wasn't inclined to make that easy. Trescott started small. Delayed responses to Ethan's technical documentation requests, slightly altered turnaround timelines on 2 minor service items. A meeting rescheduled twice without explanation. None of it was dramatic enough to escalate formally. All of it was just barely inside the margin of acceptable professional behavior, and all of it was clearly deliberate. Victoria noticed it in Ethan's weekly reports, which were factual and unadorned. He reported what happened and what the operational impact was, without characterizing Trescott's behavior or speculating about intent, which was either admirable or maddening depending on her mood when she read them. She called him on a Wednesday evening. The Trescott situation, she said when he picked up. Yeah. The sound of his background told her he was home. Something cooking, Sophie's television faintly audible from another room. You've been documenting it. I always document everything. I know. What's your read? He's testing whether I'll escalate, Ethan said. Some people do that when a new arrangement threatens an established one. They want to know what the response threshold is before they decide how to behave. And what's your preference for how we handle it? A beat. I'd rather not escalate if it can be resolved at the operational level. Escalation with a vendor creates friction that lasts past the original issue. If you can get Meridian's account director on a call, not Trescott, the person above him, and frame it around service alignment for the new maintenance structure, that gives them an opportunity to correct internally without it becoming a formal grievance. She turned this over. And if it continues after that? Then we escalate, he said without hesitation. But let's try the first thing first. I'll set it up, she said. Then, how's Sophie settling? The shift in his voice was small but perceptible. A slight easing, the way someone sounds when a subject changes to something they're less guarded about. Not because they were guarded before, but because this particular subject is simply warmer. She likes her teacher, he said. The school has a soccer team, which is basically the thing she cared about most. She's made one friend she actually mentions by name, which for Sophie is significant. What's the friend's name? Amara. They argued about something on the 3rd day, according to Sophie, and now they're best friends, which apparently is how Sophie processes social compatibility. Victoria found herself smiling again, which was happening with a frequency she didn't have a precedent for. That sounds about right. She asked me this morning if you were going to come watch one of her games, Ethan said, and then seemed to consider whether he'd volunteered that, and seemed to decide he had, and that was fine. I told her I'd mention it, and it was up to you. Victoria looked at her calendar. which was a disaster in the way it was always a disaster, and thought about standing on a sideline in November watching an 8-year-old play soccer. "When's the next game?" she said. Tut. The call with Meridian's account director, a decisive woman named Patricia Holt, who had built the company's aviation division from the ground up and did not tolerate operational sloppiness from her team, lasted 25 minutes. Victoria ran the first portion and then handed off to Ethan for the technical specifics, which he delivered with the same directness he brought to everything. No embellishment, no organizational softening, just here is what occurred, and here is what we need differently. Patricia listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and said she'd have it addressed by end of week. Trescott stopped being a problem by Thursday, not because he became cooperative, his manner remained what it was, but because the service delays stopped, the meeting cancellations stopped, and the documentation requests started receiving timely responses. Patricia Holt was apparently the kind of account director who communicated consequences in a language that translated clearly. The second friction point was internal and more complicated. Sterling Air's existing operations team had a de facto maintenance coordinator, a man named Phil Sutherland, who had been managing the day-to-day logistics of the fleet servicing for 4 years. Scheduling, vendor coordination, the administrative layer between the aircraft and the people who flew them. Phil was not a technician and had never claimed to be, but he had developed a working knowledge of the systems and a set of relationships with the Meridian team that gave him a kind of informal authority that wasn't on any org chart but was very real in the day-to-day operation. Phil and Ethan's relationship was civil in the way that relationships are civil when both parties are professionals and one of them has just been significantly repositioned relative to the other. Phil had reported to no one in particular on maintenance matters before. There'd been a gap in the org structure that he'd filled by proximity. And now there was a director of maintenance who was nominally his equal in seniority, but who held direct technical authority over the domain Phil had been informally managing. It was an ambiguous arrangement, and ambiguous arrangements created friction regardless of everyone's intentions. Victoria became aware of it through the margins. A slightly clipped exchange in a meeting she was in, a CC'd email that was passive in a way that made her read it twice. A scheduling conflict between Phil's coordination timeline and Ethan's service review that shouldn't have been a conflict but somehow was. Nothing dramatic, everything just slightly harder than it needed to be. She talked to Marcus. "Phil's not wrong to feel displaced," Marcus said, which was his way of telling her something she didn't necessarily want to hear but needed to. He spent 4 years building something with no resources or mandate, and now there's a person with a title and a budget doing the thing Phil taught himself to do. Even if Ethan does it better, and I think we can agree Ethan does it better, that's not an easy thing to sit with. Is it about the title? Partly, but I think it's more that nobody talked to Phil about how his role was changing before the change happened. He found out about Ethan's hire when everyone else did. Victoria stopped and thought about that. That was an oversight. It was a significant one, Marcus said, with the gentleness of someone who'd been waiting for her to see it. She went to Phil's office that afternoon, not to manage the situation, not to smooth things over with the kind of corporate warmth that everyone recognized as corporate warmth. She went to actually talk to him, which required sitting down and acknowledging that the transition had been handled imperfectly, and that his experience of it mattered, and that his 4 years of informal stewardship of a function that should have had formal oversight was something the organization should have recognized better than it did. Phil was a careful, practical man in his late 40s who did not respond to management performance. He listened to her with an expression that moved from prepared for deflection to something more cautious as she kept talking, and by the end, he was just listening. "What do you actually need from this arrangement to work?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely. "I need to know where the line is," he said. "Ethan has the technical authority, and I understand why. But the operational coordination, the scheduling, the vendor calendar, the crew logistics, I know those systems. I've built those systems. I don't want to hand all of that to someone new just because they have a better title." "Then you don't have to," she said. "That's your domain. Define it formally, work out the interface with Ethan, and if the two of you can't agree on the demarcation, bring it to Marcus and we'll work it out. But the answer is not for you to step back from work you're good at just because someone was added above it." He looked at her for a moment. "Does Ethan know that's how you see it?" "He will," she said. as soon as I leave this office and talk to him, which was what she did. Ethan listened to the same conversation from the other direction with the same quality of actual listening, and when she was done, he said, "Phil knows the operational layer better than I do right now. That's a fact. I don't need to own that layer. I need it to work. If he runs it and I have clear authority on the technical side, that's a reasonable arrangement. It requires you both to agree on the interface explicitly. I know. I'll talk to him. Today, if you can." "I'll talk to him now," he said, and stood up. She thought, not for the first time, that watching Ethan Carter approach a problem was instructive in a specific way that boardroom strategy sessions rarely were. He didn't optimize for looking good relative to the problem. He just went at the problem directly, without accumulating the organizational scar tissue that made most people in organizations approach problems sideways. She wondered how much of that was him, and how much was simply what happened when a person spent years doing work that wasn't witnessed by anyone who mattered, so performance had never been part of the calculation. The conversation between Ethan and Phil lasted 40 minutes in the small conference room off the operations floor, and she didn't ask about it afterward. She found out from Marcus, who found out from Jordan, who had been walking past the conference room when they came out, that they had shaken hands at the end, not the political handshake, the actual kind. She filed that alongside everything else and went back to her own work. The Geneva trip finally happened in mid-November. The Gulf Stream flew in conditions that would have previously been exactly the kind of high-pressure, cold-temperature morning that triggered the shutdown. Barometric pressure at 30.4, temperature at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of morning that had cost her 6 weeks and several $1 million over the summer. Roland ran the startup sequence and the engines fired cleanly, immediately, with the indifference of a system that had simply been corrected and had no memory of the difficulty before. Victoria sat in the rear cabin with her briefing documents and her laptop in the particular pre-meeting focus that she moved into like a gear change, and for a while she didn't think about Ethan or Hartwell or the 42 days or any of it. She thought about the Geneva partners and the contract terms and what she was prepared to concede and what she wasn't. But somewhere over the Atlantic, in the particular quiet of high-altitude flight, she put down her briefing documents and looked out the window at the dark below them and thought, this aircraft was fixed because one person paid attention to the interaction between two systems rather than looking at the systems separately. And that was, she thought, the actual thing. Not the technical detail, the timing conflict, the firmware gap, the handshake failure. Those were the mechanism. The actual thing was the habit of mind that looked at two functioning systems and asked whether they were functioning together, which was a different and harder question, and which most people never got around to asking because it required a kind of attention that no job title mandated and no standard protocol enforced. She picked up her legal pad and wrote something. Not for a presentation, not for Marcus or Diane or anyone else, just for herself. The machine works. The machines work together. These are different things, and both are necessary, and most organizations only ask about one of them. She looked at it for a while with the Atlantic below her in the dark, and the engines running exactly as they should. Then she went back to her briefing documents because Geneva was 4 hours away and the work was always there, and that was the thing about the work. It was always there, patient and indifferent, waiting for her attention the way everything important waited. The Geneva meeting went well enough that Victoria didn't trust it. That was the particular occupational hazard of her position. A negotiation that moved too cleanly in the desired direction triggered a suspicion that she was missing something, that the ease was a surface condition concealing a complication that would surface later, in a less manageable form. She'd learned this the hard way in her late 20s, when a deal with a European logistics consortium had proceeded with such frictionless efficiency that she'd celebrated early, and then 3 weeks after signing, a clause she'd read but not weighted properly turned out to carry an exclusivity provision that cost her 2 other partnerships. She didn't celebrate early anymore. She flew back from Geneva on a Thursday evening, arrived in Nashville at 2 a.m. local time, slept 4 hours, and was at her desk by 6:30 reviewing the meeting notes she'd made on the return flight. By 8 o'clock, she'd sent Marcus a summary with 3 items flagged for follow-up, and had moved on to the week's operational reports. Ethan's was at the top of the stack. It was different from the previous reports in a way she noticed before she'd consciously identified what the difference was. The formatting was the same, direct, unadorned, the same structure he'd established in week 1. But the content was denser, and the final section, which he typically used for forward-looking maintenance recommendations, was longer than usual and carried a different weight. She read it twice. He'd completed his assessment of the full fleet maintenance history going back 18 months, and had found what he described in his characteristic understatement as a pattern worth examining. Across all 3 aircraft, there were recurring gaps between the time a minor fault was flagged and the time a verification check was completed. Not the documentation gaps like the oxygen cylinder issue, but something subtler. Faults were being resolved on schedule. The verification that the resolution had held was consistently delayed, sometimes by days, sometimes by weeks, occasionally not completed at all if the aircraft went into service before the check was due. Individually, every one of these gaps was defensible. Collectively, they formed something that Ethan's report described as a maintenance philosophy that prioritizes return to service speed over systemic verification, which is a reasonable trade-off until the moment it isn't. He wasn't saying anyone had done anything wrong. He was saying the system had a structural inclination toward a specific kind of risk, and that inclination was worth correcting before the moment it became a problem rather than after. Victoria read that final phrase 3 times. Worth correcting before the moment it becomes a problem rather than after. She thought about a firmware mismatch that had sat undetected for 3 years because no one had looked at the interaction between 2 systems. She thought about the nose gear actuator on the Phenom. She thought about the oxygen cylinder documentation that had been 3 weeks from an FAA audit. She picked up her phone. Ethan answered on the second ring, which meant he was already at his desk, which at 7:40 in the morning she'd come to understand was simply where he was. "The verification gap pattern," she said. "Yeah. How long has this been building?" "Hard to say with certainty. The data I have goes back 18 months. The pattern is consistent across that whole period, which suggests it predates my window. Could be 3 years, could be longer." "What do you need to correct it?" "A revised service protocol with Meridian that builds mandatory verification windows into the return-to-service timeline. It'll add time to some turnarounds, just not much, a day or 2 on average, but it closes the gap." He paused. "There's also a staffing question. Right now, I'm the only person on the technical side doing this kind of pattern review. If I'm traveling or unavailable, it doesn't happen. You're recommending a hire. I'm recommending we at least think about it." She leaned back in her chair. "Write me a proposal. What the role would look like, what you'd need, what the cost-benefit picture is. I can have it to you by end of next week." "Good." She tapped her pen against the legal pad. "The Geneva contract. There's a dedicated flight schedule attached to it, 6 international routes over 14 months. I want to know if our current maintenance intervals can support that flight cadence without compressing the verification windows further." A brief silence while he thought. "Send me the route schedule and I'll model it against current service intervals. Give me 48 hours. "You have it," she said. There was a small pause on the line, the kind that had something in it. "How was Geneva?" he asked. The question was slightly outside the boundary of their usual exchanges. Professional, focused, not much room for the personal. And she noticed it. "Productive," she said. "The kind of productive that I don't fully trust yet." That's a reasonable response to a situation where you haven't found what's wrong with it yet. She looked at her phone for a second. "That's exactly what it is." "You'll find it," he said, with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to technical assessments, as though it were simply a question of where to look. Then, before she could respond, "I need to get Sophie to school. Can we pick this up at 9? 9 works," she said. "Demam." December arrived with the particular momentum of a month that already had too many things in it. The Geneva contract was signed in the first week, which meant the dedicated flight schedule became real and immediate rather than theoretical. The route modeling Ethan had done came back with a clear conclusion. The current Meridian service intervals were adequate for the existing flight cadence, but would require restructuring to accommodate the new schedule without compressing verification windows. He'd included 3 alternative restructuring options, each with different cost and timeline implications, along with a clear statement of which one he'd recommend and why. She took his recommendation to Diane, who reviewed it for an afternoon and came back with the assessment that it was the right call financially as well as operationally, which was not something she said about many recommendations she reviewed. The Meridian restructuring negotiation took 2 weeks and was managed jointly by Ethan and Phil Sutherland, who had settled into their working arrangement with the pragmatic efficiency of two people who'd decided that the alternative was worse. Victoria observed this from a careful distance and resisted the impulse to facilitate. Sometimes the right thing was to let people work it out and not inject management into a process that was managing itself. The hire proposal came in on a Friday afternoon, formatted with the same directness as everything else Ethan produced. 1 page of rationale, 1 page of role description, 1 page of cost projection. It was the least glamorous hiring document she'd ever received and the most useful. The role he was proposing was a systems review technician, someone with avionics background and a specific inclination toward the kind of cross-system pattern analysis that had identified the Gulf Stream problem, the kind that standard diagnostic tools didn't surface. There aren't a lot of people who think this way, he'd written in the rationale section. The skill set is specific and the hiring pool is small. I have one candidate in mind who I'd want to approach, but I want approval before I make contact because the approach itself will signal organizational intent, and I don't want to signal something I can't follow through on. She approved the search within the hour and sent back a single line. Make the contact. Tell me who it is when you're ready. His reply came back 9 minutes later. Her name is Reyes, Carmen Reyes. She's currently at a military aircraft maintenance facility in San Antonio. I worked alongside her briefly in Memphis. She was consulting on a freight carrier contract. She sees things differently than most people. Victoria looked at that last sentence for a moment. She sees things differently than most people. Coming from Ethan, who was not given to superlatives and who described things in the most precise terms available to him, this was the equivalent of someone else saying she was exceptional. She wrote back, set up the conversation. The thing nobody had told Victoria about hiring exceptional people, though she supposed she should have figured it out on her own by now, was that exceptional people had existing situations that were genuinely good and required an actual reason to leave them. Carmen Reyes was not a person sitting in a mediocre job waiting to be discovered. She was a 35-year-old avionics specialist with a DoD clearance and a role that paid well and offered the kind of technical challenge that most private sector positions couldn't match. Ethan called her on a Tuesday. Victoria didn't listen in. She'd offered to, and he'd said he'd rather handle the initial conversation himself, which she respected. He came to her office afterward and stood in the doorway with his jacket on, which meant he'd been somewhere else in the building and stopped on the way to his own office. She's interested, he said, but she has questions about what the actual work would look like day to day. She's been in government-adjacent work long enough that she's skeptical of private sector pitches. Reasonable, Victoria said. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, that we're a small fleet operation that's trying to build a maintenance philosophy that most private aviation doesn't bother with. That the work is less glamorous than what she's doing, but that she'd have more direct influence on how the system develops. And that the person she'd be working with, a slight pause, was me. Victoria looked at him. And that was the selling point? I didn't say it as a selling point, he said, mildly. She asked who she'd report to. I told her. How did she respond? Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. She said she'd heard worse answers. Set up a formal meeting, Victoria said. I want to be in it. I was going to suggest that, he said. The meeting with Carmen Reyes happened over video, which was Reyes's preference, and which gave Victoria her first look at the person Ethan had described with that specific, uncharacteristic superlative. Reyes was compact and precise in the way she occupied her side of the screen. Not rigid, just economical, like someone who had learned to operate in environments where excess motion was a liability. She had close-cropped hair and the particular quality of attention in her eyes that Victoria had come to associate with people who were genuinely listening rather than waiting for their turn. She asked good questions. Not impressive questions, the kind people ask when they want to demonstrate that they've done their research, but functionally good questions, the kind that came from actually wanting to know things. She asked about the specific failure mode Ethan had identified on the Gulf Stream. Not because the story wasn't public within the company, but because she wanted to understand his analytical process. She asked about the verification gap pattern and what the current protocol revision looked like, and whether the fleet was likely to expand and on what timeline. She also asked, directly and without apology, what had happened to the previous maintenance structure and why it had taken 42 days and 200 specialists to find a firmware mismatch. Victoria answered that one herself. Because we were asking the wrong questions of the wrong people in the wrong order, and we've built a structure now that's designed to address that. That's why this role exists. Reyes looked at her for a moment. Most people say something like that and mean it about half as much as they think they do. Probably true, Victoria said. I'd rather you evaluate whether I mean it based on what you see if you take the role. What's the timeline on the decision? Whenever you're ready. I won't tell you we need an answer by Friday because I think artificial urgency is an insult to the candidate and to the role. Reyes glanced off screen for a moment, then back. Ethan said you'd say something like that. Victoria looked at Ethan, who was sitting slightly off camera on his side of the call. He shrugged, which for him was a significant gesture. Reyes took 2 weeks. She accepted on a Thursday morning in late December with the straightforward brevity of someone who had made the decision several days earlier and waited to make sure it still looked right from a few different angles. She had a 90-day transition timeline from her current role, which meant she wouldn't start until April, which was longer than Victoria would have chosen, but which she didn't argue with because she'd told Reyes she wouldn't apply artificial urgency, and she was not going to become the kind of person who said things and then did the opposite when the things became inconvenient. April, she told Ethan when the acceptance came through. April works, he said. Gives me time to get the protocol revision fully implemented before she arrives. Better to have her walk into a functioning system than a system that's still being built. Is that consideration for her or for you? He thought about it briefly. Both, he said. Christmas fell on a Wednesday that year, and the office closed from the 23rd through the 2nd of January, which was standard, and which Victoria typically spent working from home at about 60% of her usual output while telling herself she was taking a break. The break and the work had never been especially distinguishable from each other, which was something she was aware of and had made a complicated peace with. She sent Ethan a message on the 23rd, just before the office closed. Nothing formal, just a note that said the first 3 months had exceeded her expectations and she was glad he'd agreed to come on board. She hit send before she could rewrite it into something less direct. His reply came back 4 hours later, which she suspected was because he'd been doing something with Sophie. Thank you for asking in the first place. Have a good holiday. She read it twice, which she also did not examine too closely, and put her phone down and went to make dinner. January brought a cold front and a new problem. She was in the office on the 7th, back from the holiday gap, and running at the particular intensity she always hit at the start of a new year, when the accumulated possibilities of 12 months felt briefly manageable, when Marcus came to her door at 10:30 with an expression she recognized. Consolidated Meridian, he said. She looked up. Consolidated Meridian was not the Meridian Aviation Services they contracted with for fleet maintenance. It was a much larger organization, a private equity-backed aviation conglomerate that had been systematically acquiring smaller aerospace companies and maintenance providers over the previous 3 years. She'd tracked their expansion with the detached interest she applied to industry movements that didn't directly affect her operations. What about them? She said. They've acquired Meridian Aviation Services, Marcus said, signed and closed during the holiday, effective January 1st. She set down her pen. Patricia Holt? Departed at close. Standard acquisition exit. She negotiated it as a condition of the sale, apparently. Patricia Holt was the reason their revised service protocol had been implemented without significant resistance. Patricia Holt was the reason Trescott had stopped being a problem. Patricia Holt was, in Victoria's assessment, the adult in the room at Meridian who made the relationship functional. Who's running the aviation division under Consolidated? Someone named Gareth Wills. He came over from Consolidated's aerospace acquisitions team. No maintenance background. His background is in restructuring acquired operations for profitability. Victoria looked at Marcus for a moment. Get Ethan. Ethan was in her office in 7 minutes. She told him what she'd told Marcus and watched his face do what it did when he was processing a technical problem. Not showing the processing, just going slightly still while it happened. Consolidated Meridian's playbook on acquisitions, he said, has been to standardize service protocols across all their acquired operations. Cut customization, increase throughput, reduce cost per service hour. Which is incompatible with the verification windows we just negotiated. Probably, yes. He said it flatly, without the editorializing she was entitled to feel, and he apparently didn't need to express. The question is how quickly they move on standardization and whether there's room to negotiate a carve-out for our contract. Based on what you know of their acquisition pattern, how quickly do they move? 3 to 6 months before the new service protocols reach active accounts. They usually grandfather existing contracts for one full cycle before applying the new standard. Our contract cycle renews in April. Yes. A beat. Options, she said. 3, he said, which told her he'd been thinking about this since Marcus had told him, which was probably the 7 minutes between Marcus leaving his office and arriving in hers. 1. Negotiate directly with Wills to maintain the custom protocol. Risk is that we don't know Wills and his mandate is standardization, not customization. 2. Use the acquisition as a trigger clause. Most service contracts have a material change provision that allows renegotiation or exit if the provider's ownership structure changes materially. Our contract may have that language. Does it? I don't know. Diane would. And 3? We accelerate the in-house capability, he said. If we bring the systems-level maintenance fully internal now rather than April, we reduce our Meridian dependency to routine line work that any qualified provider can handle. Victoria considered this. That's the most expensive option short-term. Most control long-term, he said. And it's a direction you were already moving. This just moves the timeline up. She looked at him. He was standing in front of her desk in his usual way. Not tense, not performing ease, just present. She noticed, not for the first time, that he never sat in her office unless she asked him to, which she'd read initially as formality and now understood was something different. It was the posture of someone who didn't need to settle into a space to think clearly in it. If I go with option 3, she said, can you accelerate the build-out on your own until Reyes arrives in April? I can manage the essential coverage. I'll be stretched. He said it without apology. There will be a period of 2 to 3 months where I'm doing 2 people's work. Is that workable? It's workable, he said. It's not comfortable. She appreciated the distinction. Get me the contract document tonight. I want to see the material change language myself. He left, and she called Diane, and by 2 in the afternoon she had the contract on her desk and the material change clause on page 47, and it was robust enough that they had genuine exit optionality. And Victoria sat with the 3 options arranged in her mind and felt the familiar cool calculus of a decision that required trading one kind of risk for another. She called Ethan again at 4. Option 3, she said. Accelerated build-out. Use the material change clause to exit Meridian at contract cycle. I want a transition plan on my desk by end of week. A brief silence. Okay. And I want to be clear that the 2 to 3 months of stretch work, I'm aware of what I'm asking. I know you are, he said, and the directness of it landed the way his directness always landed. Not blunt, just true. It's the right call. I'll manage. If it becomes unmanageable, you tell me. I will, he said. She wasn't completely sure she believed this. There was something in him she'd noticed that calibrated toward bearing load quietly, the particular habit of a person who'd been the only adult in a household for a long time and had learned to not make the difficulty visible until it was unavoidable. She made a note to watch for it rather than wait for him to report it. The transition plan arrived on Friday evening, late enough that she suspected he'd been at the office after Sophie was asleep. It was thorough in the way that made thoroughness feel like a form of integrity. Not thorough for the sake of demonstrating effort, but thorough because there were actually a lot of moving parts, and they all needed to be accounted for. She read it at her kitchen table with a glass of wine she'd poured and forgotten and was now drinking cold, and she thought about the particular journey a document like this had taken to exist, from a firmware mismatch on a grounded aircraft at a small airfield in rural Tennessee, through 6 weeks of expensive failure, through a question that should have been asked on day 1, through a check and a coffee machine, and an 8-year-old with opinions about her father's advice, to this Friday night in January, to this plan for building something that would outlast the situation that had made it necessary. The plan was good, more than good. It was the work of someone who had been thinking clearly about the problem for longer than the immediate crisis made visible, the way a river runs deeper than its surface suggests. She wrote in the margin, at the top of the first page, 2 words: approved. Begin. And then she sat there for a while with the kitchen quiet around her, thinking about all the plans that never got written because the right person was never asked the right question, and the particular weight of that waste, and what she intended to do about it, not just here, in this company, with these aircraft and this team, but more broadly, in the way she led and the questions she trained herself to ask. She'd written 2 things on that legal pad in the weeks since the Gulfstream had come back to life. She turned to the next blank page and wrote a 3rd. Competence doesn't announce itself. Ask anyway. She looked at it for a moment, then she closed the pad and finished the wine and went to bed, because the work would be there in the morning, and she'd learned, slowly and badly and against her nature, that she was better at the work when she'd slept. February arrived, and the stretch was real. Ethan managed it in the way he managed most things, without dramatic evidence of the difficulty, which did not mean the difficulty wasn't there. Victoria could see it in small calibrations. The Thursday evening, he replied to her email at 10:45 with an apology for the late response that he didn't usually include, because Ethan did not typically apologize for the timing of professional correspondence. The Friday morning, he came in with the particular compression around his eyes that she'd learned to read as fatigue that was being managed rather than rested. The week in late February, when Sophie had a stomach bug and was out of school for 3 days, and Ethan split his time between the office and home with an efficiency that she was fairly sure was costing him more than he was letting anyone see. She didn't manage it overtly. She adjusted what she could, moved 2 non-urgent deliverable deadlines without explaining why, cleared a Tuesday afternoon meeting from his calendar when it appeared on a week where he already had 3 major technical reviews scheduled, asked Phil Sutherland to absorb one specific piece of coordination work that was technically in Ethan's lane, but that Phil was fully capable of handling and would, she suspected, be willing to do if asked directly and honestly. She asked him directly and honestly. Phil looked at her for a moment. Is Ethan having a hard time? He's carrying more than was planned for, she said. And I want to even it out where I can without making a thing of it. He wouldn't ask for help, Phil said. It wasn't quite a question. No, she said, he wouldn't. Phil nodded, with the expression of a man who recognized something. I'll take the Singapore coordination. Tell him I needed the practice with the new routing system. I'll tell him exactly that, she said, and appreciated that they both understood what they were actually doing and neither of them needed to say it. She told Ethan the next morning, casually during a brief check-in, that Phil was handling the Singapore routing coordination because he'd wanted to work with the new system. Ethan looked at her in the way he looked at her when he suspected something was true that she wasn't quite saying, and then he looked back at his desk. Okay, he said. Thanks. And then after a beat, Sophie's back at school. Good, she said. How's she doing? Better. She's annoyed about missing soccer practice. He paused. She wanted me to ask you something. Victoria waited. If you're still planning to come to a game, there's one on Saturday. She doesn't want me to make it weird by asking too formally. He said this last part with the faint dryness that was his specific version of embarrassed. So I'm asking informally. Victoria looked at her calendar in her head. Saturday was genuinely clear, a rare condition in her life. Tell her I'll be there, she said. Something in Ethan's face settled, not dramatically, just that small shift she'd learned to look for. Okay, he said. She'll be pleased. He left, and Victoria sat for a moment in the particular warmth of something that had nothing to do with business, which was unusual enough in her office that she let herself sit with it for an extra moment before going back to work. The soccer field was not what Victoria had expected, which was her own fault for not having expectations calibrated to anything real. She'd pictured something organized, bleachers maybe, a proper facility. What she found on Saturday morning was a municipal park field with painted lines that were beginning to fade at the corners, two sets of metal bleachers that held perhaps 40 people total, a folding table near the sideline with an orange cooler and a hand-lettered sign that said Valley FCU, 9 girls, and approximately 30 parents dressed for weather that had not made up its mind between late winter and early spring. She arrived 7 minutes before kickoff, which she'd timed deliberately, and stood at the edge of the bleachers trying to locate Ethan in a crowd of unfamiliar faces. He found her first. "You came," he said, from about 10 feet away, with the tone of someone who had believed she would, but had not quite believed it until this moment. "I said I would," she said. He nodded, accepting this, and gestured toward a space on the lower bleacher where there was room. He was wearing the same work jacket he wore everywhere, and he had a travel mug that was not his usual thermos, which she suspected was a Sophie-directed upgrade because the thermos had apparently been deemed insufficiently parental for public appearances. He looked less tired than he had on Friday, which meant the weekend had given him something the week had taken. "Where is she?" Victoria asked. He pointed. Sophie was at the far end of the field in a yellow and blue kit that was slightly too large for her, shin guards visible above her socks, talking to a girl Victoria presumed was Amara, with the animated focus of someone discussing something of genuine tactical importance. "She knows you're here," Victoria asked. "I texted her coach to tell her," he said. "The coach told her before warm-ups. She pretended not to care." "Did she care?" "She's been checking the sideline every 30 seconds since warm-ups started," he said, and his voice had the particular warmth of a man who found his daughter's emotional transparency both moving and faintly amusing. Victoria looked at the field, at this small person in the oversized kit who was pretending not to look at the sideline, and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't immediately try to name. The game was not elegant. U9 soccer was not, as it turned out, a sport of tactical sophistication. It was 12 small people chasing a ball with a fierce collective energy that bore only a loose relationship to the formal structure of the game as Victoria understood it. But Sophie, she noticed, was different from the general chase. She positioned herself slightly ahead of the cluster, reading the ball's trajectory before it arrived, moving to where it was going rather than where it was. Twice in the first half, she created chances that her teammates couldn't quite finish. Once she scored, a low shot to the left corner that the opposing goalkeeper didn't fully reach, and she wheeled away from the net with her arms out, and her face split open with the kind of joy that 8-year-olds have before they learn to moderate it for an audience. She looked directly at the sideline, at her father, and at Victoria, standing beside him. Ethan raised his travel mug in a small acknowledging gesture that said everything without performing anything. Victoria clapped, which wasn't something she did in professional context, but which seemed right here, on this fading lined field, on this ambivalent February morning for this particular child. Sophie grinned and turned back to the game. "She's good," Victoria said. "She works at it," Ethan said, which was the highest compliment he appeared to give anything. They stood there on the sideline for the rest of the first half, not talking much, watching. Around them, the other parents called out encouragements and occasional instructions that the children ignored, and once or twice the whole sideline surged forward with collective agitation when the ball came near either goal. Ethan stayed still through all of it, not uninvested, just settled, the way he was settled in every context she'd seen him in. At halftime, Sophie ran over with the unself-conscious speed of a child who had not yet learned to approach things gradually. She stopped in front of Victoria, slightly out of breath, with a grass stain on her left knee that hadn't been there at kickoff. "You actually came," she said. "I said I would," Victoria said, which was the same thing she'd said to Ethan, and which landed the same way. Received, considered, and apparently found to be sufficient. "Did you see my goal?" "I did." "It went to the left because the keeper was leaning right," Sophie said, with the precision of someone who wanted the tactical reasoning acknowledged, not just the outcome. "I saw her leaning before I shot." "That's good decision-making," Victoria said. Sophie looked at her with a brief evaluating flash. "Dad says that's the difference between playing the game and understanding the game." Victoria glanced at Ethan. He was looking at his travel mug. "He's right," Victoria said. Sophie seemed satisfied. She looked between the two of them for a moment with the unfiltered perception of a child who noticed things that adults had decided not to say out loud, And then she said, "I'm glad you're friends." With the directness that Victoria had come to understand was simply Sophie's natural register, and ran back to her team. The word friends sat in the air for a moment. Ethan looked at the field. Victoria looked at the field. Neither of them said anything, and the particular quality of the silence was different from the silences she'd catalogued from him before. Those were comfortable, settled, the silence of people who didn't need to fill space. This one had something in it, something that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but that was aware of itself. "She's not wrong," Victoria said, eventually. "No," Ethan said. "She usually isn't." The second half started, and the moment passed into the game, and Victoria stood on that sideline for the remaining 22 minutes and thought about a question she'd been turning over for weeks without quite letting herself look at it directly. What she was building at Sterling Air, and what the people inside it were to her, and whether she'd spent so long treating proximity as a liability. The particular discipline of the person at the top who maintains a specific kind of distance because the alternative compromises the judgment, that she'd confused distance with clarity. She didn't resolve it on the sideline, but she let herself look at it, which was something. Valley FC won 3-1. Sophie scored once and assisted once and celebrated both with equal enthusiasm, which was the right proportion. Carmen Reyes arrived in April on a Tuesday, which was not a dramatic arrival. She drove herself, declined the offer of an official orientation schedule, and asked instead if she could spend her first week reading maintenance records and walking through the aircraft before meeting with anyone formally. Ethan had told Victoria this was likely. Victoria had approved it before he finished the sentence. By the end of Reyes's first week, she had produced a 3-page addendum to Ethan's verification gap analysis that identified 2 additional pattern anomalies he hadn't caught. Not because he'd been careless, but because they required a specific kind of avionics background to see, which was precisely why he'd wanted her in the role. He came to Victoria's office on Friday afternoon with the addendum in hand and the expression of someone who had just had their professional judgment confirmed in a way they found deeply satisfying. "She found things I missed," he said. "I know, she sent me a copy." "Good." He set the document on her desk. "She wants to propose a monthly cross-system review protocol, not just fleet-wide. She wants to look at the interface between our maintenance systems and the operational scheduling systems. She thinks there may be communication gaps there too." Victoria looked at him. "Between the maintenance systems and the operational systems?" "Yeah. Like the interface gap between 2 systems that were each functioning correctly, but not functioning correctly together." He held her gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said, again, with something in his voice that was too contained to be called amusement, but was in the same territory. "Tell her yes," Victoria said, "and tell her to bring whatever she needs to make it work." He took the document back and turned to leave. "Ethan." He stopped. She'd been thinking about how to say this for a while, which was unusual. She was not typically someone who labored over how to phrase things, preferring directness to polish. But this felt like something that needed to be said right, not just said. "The organizational audit," she said, "the one I asked Marcus to start in November, looking at overlooked competency across the company. I remember you mentioning it. It's turned up 7 people," she said. 7 people doing work that significantly exceeds what their role descriptions account for, in departments that had no mechanism for that work to become visible to anyone who could act on it. She paused. 3 of them have already been repositioned. The other 4 are in process. He was quiet. "I'm telling you because it started with you," she said. "And because I think you should know that the thing that happened at Hartwell, so the 6 weeks and the 200 specialists, and the answer that was standing right there the whole time, that wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a systematic one. And fixing the systematic failure is taking longer than fixing the aircraft did. But it's happening." He stood in her doorway for a moment with the document in his hand. "How many more do you think there are?" he said. "Across the company?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer. I'm asking the question consistently now. Marcus is asking it. Diane is building it into the performance review process. We'll find out over time." He nodded slowly. "It's the right thing to do." "I know," she said. "I just wish I'd been doing it before I had a reason to." He looked at her with the directness that was simply how he looked at things. No judgment in it, just accuracy. Most people start when they have a reason to, he said. The question is whether they keep going after the reason gets comfortable. She sat with that for a moment. I intend to, she said. I know, he said, and left. The full Meridian exit was completed by the end of April, which was 3 weeks later than the original transition plan had projected, and 2 weeks earlier than the revised plan had estimated, which meant Ethan had managed the gap through sheer operational discipline across a period that had, by any objective measure, been too much for one person. The exit itself was handled without drama. The material change clause gave them clean legal standing, Patricia Holt's departure had been documented as a qualifying trigger, and Gareth Wills at Consolidated Meridian accepted the termination notice with the resigned efficiency of a man who'd seen this play out before and had other acquisitions to worry about. What replaced Meridian was smaller, more specific, and Ethan's. Not his in a proprietary sense. Victoria owned the operation and was clear-eyed about that, but his in the way that things built by a particular person carry their maker's specific intelligence. The in-house maintenance capability he'd constructed over 5 months had the same qualities as everything else he produced: direct, thorough, not interested in looking impressive, interested in working correctly. He'd contracted 3 specialized independent technicians for the work Reyes and he couldn't cover internally, and he'd selected them on criteria that looked slightly unusual to Diane until she understood what she was looking at, which was someone hiring for the ability to see system interactions rather than system components. You're building a team that thinks like you, Diane told him during a budget review in early May. I'm building a team that thinks about problems from multiple angles simultaneously, he said. I'm one angle, Reyes is another. The contractors cover the others. Is there a difference between those two things? He thought about it. Hopefully yes, he said. A team that thinks like me would have my blind spots. A team that covers multiple angles has fewer. Diane reported this exchange to Victoria with the tone of someone who had found it instructive and was passing it along on that basis. Victoria added it to the accumulation. All the things Ethan said that she found herself returning to, not because they were aphoristic or designed to be remembered, but because they had the quality of something a person arrived at through actual experience rather than borrowed wisdom. The thing between Victoria and Ethan, the thing Sophie had named simply and accurately on the sideline in February, the thing that neither of them had addressed directly in the months since, didn't resolve itself tidily, because things between real people rarely did. What it did was grow in the way that things grow when two people are in regular proximity and are both honest and are both, in their different ways, slightly cautious about the things they value. It was in the after-hours calls that started as operational and sometimes didn't stay that way entirely. In the Tuesday evening in March when she'd called about a Geneva contract addendum and they'd spent 40 minutes on that and then another 20 on something Sophie had said about why people pretended not to care about things they cared about, which was a philosophical question that an 8-year-old had apparently posed at dinner and that Ethan had found he couldn't answer to his own satisfaction. And the Saturday in April when she'd run into him and Sophie at a farmer's market 2 blocks from her building, and the 3 of them had walked a circuit of the stalls together, and Sophie had negotiated the purchase of a jar of local honey with a vendor with the focused seriousness of a small business person, and Ethan had watched her with that expression that was too layered to have a single name. It was in the fact that she knew what that expression meant, which required having watched it often enough to learn to read it. Nothing was said because nothing needed to be said yet, which was a distinction she held carefully. The difference between not saying something because the time wasn't right and not saying something because the saying felt too risky. The first was patience. The second was a different kind of problem, and she watched herself to make sure she wasn't confusing them. In June, she found herself on the sideline of another soccer game, which had become a periodic occurrence, not every week, but enough to be a pattern. Enough that the other Valley FC parents recognized her and nodded. Enough that Sophie had started telling people that her dad's boss was a soccer person now, which was not accurate, but which Victoria found she didn't particularly want to correct. After the game, a 2-2 draw that Sophie took very seriously, Ethan and Victoria stood near the parking lot while Sophie talked to Amara with the intensity that characterized all of Sophie's social interactions, and Ethan said, without looking at her, "She asks about you when you're not at games." Victoria didn't say anything immediately. "I thought you should know," he said. "Not to create pressure, just, she does." "What does she ask?" "Whether you're coming, what you're working on. Once she asked if you had people who took care of you." He paused. I didn't have a good answer to that one. Victoria looked at the field, where the grass was beginning to green up in the early summer warmth. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were good at taking care of yourself." Another pause. "She said that wasn't the same thing." It wasn't the same thing. That was precisely accurate, and coming from Sophie, it was the kind of accuracy that had no defensive position available to it. "She's not wrong," Victoria said. "She usually isn't," Ethan said, which was what he'd said in February, and the echo of it was not accidental. She looked at him then, and he was already looking at her, which meant he'd been looking at her while she looked at the field, and the directness of it didn't have the quality of someone trying to communicate something he couldn't say. It had the quality of someone being simply present, which was the thing he was, consistently, in every context she'd seen him in. "I don't know how to do this carefully," she said. "I know how to do the work. The space between that and everything else?" She stopped. It wasn't a complete sentence, and she didn't try to finish it artificially. "I know," he said. "Me too. Sophie matters. Your situation matters. The fact that I'm your employer matters, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't complicate the structure." "It does complicate it," he said without dismissing it. "That's true. So I think we go slowly," she said, "and we're honest about what we're doing." He looked at her for a long moment. "Slowly I can do," he said, "and I'm always honest, you know that." She did know that. It was one of the things she'd understood about him from early on, that his honesty wasn't a performance or a policy. It was structural, like the way he approached maintenance. He needed to see what was actually true before he could address it, and there was no version of that process that included convenient omissions. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Sophie appeared at Ethan's elbow with her bag over her shoulder and her shin guards in her hand, looking between the two of them with the perception that she consistently applied to conversations she hadn't been part of. "Are you two talking about work?" she asked. "Not exactly," Ethan said. Sophie looked at Victoria. Victoria returned the look. "Okay," Sophie said, with the tone of someone filing information away for later use. "Can we get food? I'm hungry and we drew, which means I need food more than if we'd won." "That's not how nutrition works," Ethan said. "It's definitely how I work," Sophie said, and started for the parking lot. Ethan looked at Victoria. "Do you want to come?" he said. "Just food. Sophie will do most of the talking." It was the simplest invitation she'd received in years. No subtext, no performance, just a man asking a person he was beginning, carefully and honestly, to let into his life whether she wanted to join them for a meal. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." The summer moved the way summers did when you were busy. Faster than you meant it to and slower than you feared, with enough good days scattered through the difficult ones to make the accounting come out roughly even. The Sterling Air maintenance operation completed its first full quarter under the in-house model in July, and the numbers that Diane put together told a story that was clear enough that Victoria had Marcus circulate the analysis to the full leadership team. Cost per flight hour was down 11% from the Meridian average. Verification completion rate was at 97%, compared to the 63% Ethan had identified in the retrospective analysis of the previous 18 months. 0 compliance flags in 2 FAA interactions. The Geneva fleet routes were running on schedule with no maintenance-related delays. These were numbers. They were real, and they mattered. But Victoria had learned, in the months since October, that the number that mattered most wasn't on any of Diane's spreadsheets. It was the number of questions she was asking, and where she was asking them, and who she was asking. She'd restructured the quarterly leadership review to include a standing agenda item she called an operational floor check, a rotating set of conversations with people at non-management levels across the company, not focus groups or surveys, just direct conversations about what they saw and what they thought, and what they'd noticed that nobody had asked about. It was uncomfortable in the way that structural changes were uncomfortable, and it produced information that was sometimes difficult to act on, and sometimes actionable in ways that were embarrassingly simple. In the first 2 rounds, the floor checks had surfaced a routing inefficiency in the logistics division that a senior operations coordinator had identified a year and a half ago and mentioned to her direct manager and never heard back about. It had surfaced a vendor quality issue in the supply chain that 3 different warehouse staff had noticed independently and assumed someone above them was aware of. It had surfaced a software workflow problem in the client communication system that the client-facing team had developed a 17-step manual workaround for, which they'd been executing daily for 8 months because the formal process for requesting software fixes required sign-off from 2 departments that had stopped communicating with each other. None of these things were dramatic. None of them were the kind of crises that made it into board presentations. They were the slow friction of a large organization that had grown fast and hadn't always asked the right people what they were seeing. She fixed them. All of them. Not all at once. The software issue took 3 months to properly address, and the vendor quality problem required renegotiating a contract. But she fixed them. And she was systematic about it. And Marcus was systematic about tracking them. And by August, there was a working process rather than a single instinct. One of the people she talked to during an August floor check was a young logistics coordinator named Benny Tran, 26 years old, who had been with the company for 11 months and who had developed, on his own initiative and without anyone asking, a predictive model for identifying likely delivery delays based on weather pattern combinations and historical route data. He'd built it in a spreadsheet because he didn't have access to the company's data systems at his level, and he'd been using it to quietly adjust his own workflow for 4 months, and it had improved his on-time performance by 18%, and no one had known about it except Benny. Victoria sat with Benny for 40 minutes in a small conference room on the 7th floor, listening to him explain the model with the careful hesitancy of someone who wasn't sure whether what he'd built was going to be received as initiative or as overstepping, and she thought, with a clarity that was no longer surprising but still landed with force, "Here is another one." She told Marcus about Benny that afternoon. "How many is that?" Marcus said. "Since November?" 11. 12, including Benny. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do with this?" "I want it to be a system," she said, "not a series of accidental discoveries. I want the organization to have a mechanism for people like Benny to surface what they know without having to wait for someone at my level to accidentally ask the right question. That's a significant structural change." "I know," she said. "I want a proposal by end of month. Use Diane on the structural side and talk to Ethan about how he'd approach the knowledge surfacing problem. He's thought about this more than anyone." Marcus paused again. "You want Ethan on an organizational design project." "He diagnosed a systematic failure in this organization that 200 specialists missed," she said. "And then he built a maintenance structure that solved the problem at the root rather than the surface. Yes, I want him on an organizational design project. He's not going to love that it's outside his lane." "I know," she said. "Ask him anyway." Ethan did not love it, exactly, but he engaged with it the way he engaged with everything, seriously and without performance. He and Marcus and Diane met 4 times over 3 weeks and produced a proposal that was, as Diane put it, structurally unusual but operationally rigorous, which was a fair description of anything Ethan had a hand in. The proposal was for what they called a competency visibility program, not a suggestion box, not a talent identification process, but a structured set of direct conversations embedded into the annual review cycle at every level, asking specifically what each person knew that wasn't captured in their role description and what they'd noticed that nobody above them had addressed. The answers would be routed to a small cross-functional team with the mandate and authority to act on what they found within a defined time frame. It was not complicated. That was deliberate. Ethan had pushed back twice on elements that added process without adding function, and Diane had agreed both times, and Marcus had let them argue it out without intervening, which was the right call. Victoria read the proposal on a Thursday evening at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd sat in the early days of the Gulfstream problem with a legal pad and the particular focused dread of a problem she couldn't solve. The table had accumulated things since then. A coffee ring from a Saturday morning she remembered, a scratch from Sophie's backpack zipper on a day in March when the 3 of them had ended up here after the farmer's market, the small physical record of a life that had been expanding in directions she hadn't planned. She wrote approved at the top of the first page and signed it. Then she sat for a while. She was 30 years old. She had built a billion-dollar company through a combination of clear vision, relentless work, and a willingness to be wrong that she'd cultivated deliberately because she'd noticed early that people who couldn't be wrong got slower over time. She had a floor-to-ceiling window in her office and a penthouse and a legal pad with 3 lines on it that had become a kind of private document of what the previous year had taught her. She went and got the pad and turned to the page with the 3 lines. The assumption of irrelevance is not a neutral act. It costs things. The machine works. The machines work together. These are different things and both are necessary, and most organizations only ask about one of them. Competence doesn't announce itself. Ask anyway. She looked at them for a while. Then she wrote a 4th. The answer is usually already there. The question is whether you've built something that allows it to be heard. She thought about a man in a work jacket standing at the edge of a hangar with a thermos, watching, saying nothing, because nobody had asked. She thought about what it cost, not just her 6 weeks and her millions, but what it cost him, all those years of knowing things that the rooms he was in didn't have a mechanism to receive. She thought about Benny Tran and his spreadsheet and his 18% improvement that had been invisible for 4 months. She thought about the 7 people Marcus had identified, and the 12 since then, and however many more there were in the quiet periphery of the organization, carrying knowledge that the structure hadn't learned to ask for yet. That was the actual problem. Not the firmware gap, not the verification windows, not the meridian transition. The actual problem was an organizational habit of assuming that the people who knew things and the people with visible authority to act on things were the same people, when often they weren't even in the same room. She'd spent a year correcting that assumption in every way she could reach, and she'd made progress, and the progress was real, and it wasn't enough yet. She didn't write that down. She just sat with it, because some things needed to be uncomfortable rather than resolved, needed to stay in the form of an obligation rather than a conclusion. So they kept producing motion instead of settling into something you could file away and consider handled. In September, on a Sunday afternoon, Victoria was in her apartment when her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan that said simply, "Sophie wants to show you something. Are you free?" She texted back, "Yes." They arrived 20 minutes later. Sophie had a drawing set, not the casual drawing of a child filling time, but something she'd worked on. You could see the effort in it, the multiple lines where she'd corrected herself, the particular seriousness of someone who had tried to make a thing look the way she saw it in her head. It was the view from Ethan's office, the river, the city curve, the specific geometry of the window frame. She'd done it in colored pencil, and the proportions were not exact, and the perspective had the characteristic almost rightness of a child who understood what perspective was, but was still learning how to execute it. At the bottom, in her handwriting, she'd written, "Dad's window," where he uses his knowledge. Victoria held it for a long moment. She looked at Ethan over the top of Sophie's head. He had the expression she'd spent a year learning to read, the one that was too layered for a single name, the one that had pride and warmth and something more private underneath. All of it held together with the self-possession of a man who had learned, over years of doing excellent work in rooms that didn't notice him, to carry what mattered internally. "It's for you," Sophie said. "If you want it." "I want it," Victoria said. She meant the drawing. She meant more than the drawing, and Sophie, who noticed things, appeared to know this and looked satisfied in the quiet way she looked satisfied when the world was confirming something she'd already decided was true. Victoria kept the drawing. She had it framed. Not expensively, just properly, the way things worth keeping deserve to be kept. And she hung it in her office, not on the prominent wall where clients could see it, but on the wall beside her desk, in her line of sight when she looked up from her work. The river, the city, the window frame, Dad's window, where he uses his knowledge. She looked at it every day, which was the point, not as a reminder of a problem she'd solved, but as a reminder of the kind of attention it took to not keep making the same mistake, the attention that asked and kept asking, and understood that the most important information in any room was often held by the person no one had thought to face directly, and say, "What do you see that I'm not seeing?" The question cost nothing. The asking of it cost nothing. The not asking of it, she now knew in the specific and expensive way that you know things you've paid for, cost everything. She looked at the drawing and she looked at the river in the real window opposite, and outside her door the company ran. Ethan in his office 1 floor down, Reyes in her systematic patient examination of the spaces between systems. Phil Sutherland running the operational coordination with the thoroughness of a man who'd been given room to do what he was good at. Benny Tran with his new data access and his model that was now being formalized into a company-wide tool. Marcus and Diane building the scaffolding for a program that would, over time, make the next Ethan Carter slightly less invisible, slightly sooner, at slightly less cost to everyone involved. It wasn't finished. It was never finished. That was the nature of the work. Not a problem you solved and filed, but a direction you chose and kept choosing every day, and the questions you asked, and the rooms you entered, and the people you turned toward and said, "I'm listening. What do you know?" Victoria Sterling turned back to her desk, and the morning's work, and the ongoing difficult project of building something worth building, and she did not feel particularly that she had arrived anywhere. She felt more accurately that she understood better where she was going, which was not the same thing but was, in her experience, more useful. Outside, the city moved through another ordinary day. Somewhere in it, a small girl in a soccer kit was learning that the difference between playing and understanding was where you looked before the ball arrived. It was, Victoria thought, not a bad thing to learn early.